There is a room somewhere tonight, quiet now, the lights down, the world outside gone still. And in that room, you are awake. Not loudly awake, not anxiously awake in the way the word usually lands, but awake in a quieter sense, present in a way the day never quite allows, noticing things, the weight of the blanket, the faint sound of something settling in the walls, a feeling in your chest that arrived sometime in the afternoon and never fully left. You know this feeling. You have known it for years. It is not pain exactly, not dread. It is something more like weight, the accumulated residue of a day spent in proximity to other people, their moods, their silences, their unspoken tensions. You absorbed all of it. You always do. Most people fall asleep within minutes of lying down. Their nervous system releases the day. The lights go off upstairs, one room at a time, and they are gone. But you are still here. There is a reason for that. And tonight, a Swiss psychiatrist who died in 1961 will help us understand it. His name was Carl Jung. He worked for decades in a red brick house on the shore of Lake Zurich in Küsnacht, Switzerland. He spent his life studying the part of the human mind that most of his colleagues refused to take seriously, the part that feels before it thinks, that knows before it understands, that registers the emotional temperature of a room before anyone has spoken a word. He called it the unconscious. But what he was really describing in many of his most careful passages was the experience of people who feel too much. If that phrase landed somewhere in you just now, if it arrived with recognition rather than resistance, then you already know what tonight is about. There are two kinds of sensitivity. One is a wound, the other is a door. By the end of tonight, we will have spent enough time with Jung to understand the difference. But we begin slowly. We begin here, in this room, with the weight of what you carried today. Jung wrote in his autobiography memories, dreams, reflections about his earliest awareness of inner life. He was a child in Basel in the 1880s, the son of a Protestant pastor who struggled with faith, and a mother whose moods shifted in ways the child could not predict. He learned early to read the atmosphere of a room before anyone spoke. He learned to feel the gap between what people said and what they meant, between the face they showed and the face they were. That gap he would spend his entire career trying to name. He was not unusual in this sensitivity. He was unusual only in refusing to dismiss it. Most people who feel what others don't are taught to dismiss it. They are told they are too sensitive, too intense, that they need to toughen up, that they take things too personally, that the world does not work the way they seem to think it does. And so they learn to be quiet about it. They learn to carry what they feel in private. They learn to smile in the rooms that exhaust them, and then come home and lie awake trying to put down what they could not name. This is the weight, not a flaw, a frequency. Jung believed it was one of the most important aspects of the human psyche, this capacity to sense what others have not yet articulated. He built an entire typology around it. He studied it in his patients, in himself, in the myths and dreams that surfaced across centuries and cultures. Tonight, we will follow that study slowly, chapter by chapter, not rushing, not summarizing, sitting with each idea the way you might sit with a thought that has been waiting for the right hour. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The ideas will come gently. You do not need to hold on to any of them. We begin. Chapter 2. Why Some Souls Perceive More. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist, published The Principles of Psychology in 1890. It was 1,200 pages long. Colleagues called it the most comprehensive account of human consciousness ever written in English. But there is a passage near the middle of that book that most people overlook. James describes what he calls the fringe of consciousness, the dim periphery of awareness that surrounds every clear thought. Most people, he argues, experience this fringe as noise, background, static to be tuned out. A smaller number experience it as signal. These are the people who cannot not notice, who walk into a gathering and feel, before any conversation begins, exactly where the tension is, who hear the difference between a voice saying, "I'm fine," and a voice meaning it, who sense the mood of a room through the furniture arrangement, the silence between sentences, the way someone holds their coffee cup. James had no clinical name for this. He was simply describing something he had observed in his patients, his colleagues, and himself. Carl Jung, reading James in the early years of the 20th century, recognized what he was describing immediately, and he took it further. In Psychological Types, published in 1921, Jung developed a framework for understanding how different minds process experience. He described 8 distinct types, ways that consciousness orients itself toward the world. Among them, he identified what he called the feeling type, an orientation in which value, meaning, and relational truth are primary. People in whom feeling is the dominant function do not experience the world as a set of facts to be analyzed. They experience it as a field of significance to be navigated. This is not weakness, it is a different instrument. Imagine 2 people walking into the same meeting. One leaves with a clear account of what was said. The other leaves with an account of what was not said, the unspoken frustration in the third chair, the slightly too long pause before an agreement was offered, the person in the corner who smiled at every joke but did not mean any of them. Both accounts are true, both are useful, but only one of them is usually asked for. The feeling type often carries information that has no acceptable channel. There is no form to fill in, no meeting where you can report that the project lead seems quietly desperate. No language for saying something is wrong in this room and no one will acknowledge it. So the feeling type carries it alone. Elaine Aron, an American psychologist who published the highly sensitive person in 1996, spent a decade researching this. She was not a Jungian by training. She was an empirical researcher. But her data kept pointing towards something Jung had named 70 years earlier. A significant minority of people, she estimated 15 to 20%, process sensory and emotional input more deeply than others. Not more anxiously, more deeply. There is a difference. Depth of processing means that the attuned person does not merely register an experience, they register its layers. The implication beneath the surface, the emotional undertow. The thing being communicated through what is not being said. This is exhausting in a way that is almost impossible to explain to someone who does not share the experience. It is not like being physically tired. It is more like finishing a day of translation, rendering a constant stream of hidden meaning into legible form, with no one else in the room to confirm the reading. Jung understood this. He wrote about patients who came to him burned out, alienated, convinced that something was wrong with them. Many of them were not ill. They were simply carrying more than the culture had taught them to put down. Let your jaw soften. The weight you are carrying tonight is not imaginary. It is not weakness. It is what happens when you have been feeling all day what others have not noticed. That is where we begin. What happens next, what Jung spent his career uncovering, is that this sensitivity, when understood rather than suppressed, becomes something entirely different. But we will get there slowly. Chapter 3. Jung and the Sensitive Psyche. In 1906, Carl Jung sent Sigmund Freud a copy of his research on word associations. He was 31 years old, working at the Berholzli Psychiatric Clinic in Zurich. Freud was 50, already famous, already controversial. The correspondence that followed became one of the most documented intellectual friendships in the history of psychology. And then, in 1912, it ended. The break came over what might seem like an abstract disagreement, whether the libido was primarily sexual, as Freud insisted, or whether it was a broader form of psychic energy, as Jung believed. But beneath the theory, there was something more personal. Jung had observed in Freud a pattern he recognized in many of his patients. A man of extraordinary intelligence who had learned very early to armor the places where feeling threatened to overwhelm him. Freud built systems, meticulous, brilliant, airtight systems. The unconscious as a storage room for what we cannot bear to know. The defense mechanisms, the talking cure, all of it structured, contained, logical. Jung did not doubt the genius of it, but he kept finding, in his own patients and in his own interior life, experiences that the system could not hold. He began to believe that the sensitive psyche, the psyche that feels what others miss, was not neurotic. It was not a psyche in need of correction. It was a psyche in contact with something real. He called that something the unconscious, but he meant it differently from Freud. For Freud, the unconscious was a vault of repressed material, dangerous, irrational, to be made conscious only under careful clinical control. For Jung, the unconscious was more like a depth, a layer of the self that contained not only repressed content, but also symbols, archetypes, instincts, and what he called the collective unconscious, the deep shared substrate of human experience. The layer in which every culture's myths encode the same fundamental patterns. The sensitive person, Jung argued, often has a more permeable boundary between consciousness and this deeper layer. They feel the weight of the collective. They carry, without knowing it, emotions that belong not only to their own history, but to the room, the city, the time they inhabit. This is not mysticism, it is phenomenology, a description of what certain people actually experience. Marie-Louise von Franz, who worked alongside Jung for decades at the C.G. Jung Institute in Zurich, described this permeability in her 1971 lecture series on the inferior function. She said that the people Jung called feeling types were often described by others as irrational, but they were not irrational. They were reasoning from a different set of data that the more thinking-oriented person had already filtered out before the meeting began. Notice that. If you have ever been told you are too emotional, too reactive, too much, consider what you were being asked to discard, not your irrationality, your data. The room at the Bergholzli Clinic, 1910. A patient sits across from Jung. She is a woman in her late 30s. She has been told by 3 previous doctors that her symptoms are hysterical. She arrives expecting dismissal. Jung asks her to tell him the images that come to her unbidden at night. She tells him they are vivid, strange, full of symbols she cannot explain. Jung does not try to explain them either. He sits with them. He asks her how each one makes her feel. Something shifts in that room. Not because Jung fixed her, because he took seriously what she had been taught to dismiss about herself. That is the beginning of the work he would spend his life refining. The idea that the sensitive psyche is not broken, it is in contact. It needs not to be corrected, but to be read. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Something is trying to be read in you too. We keep going. Chapter 4. Feeling what others miss. There is a quality of attention that most people have been trained out of. It is the attention you had before you learned to be efficient. Before the school day taught you to sort information quickly, what counts, what doesn't, what to report, and what to leave behind. Before the adult world taught you that there are acceptable things to notice and unacceptable ones. When you were very young, you noticed everything. The tension between your parents at dinner, the teacher's forced cheerfulness on the Friday before the holidays, the way a particular room in a particular house made you want to leave without knowing why. You were not wrong about any of it. John Bowlby, the British psychologist who developed attachment theory in the 1950s and 1960s, described what he called the infant's primary attunement. Before language, a child develops an extraordinarily refined ability to read the emotional state of their caretaker, a slight shift in tone, a subtle stiffening of posture, a pause where there was usually warmth. The infant registers all of it because all of it has survival relevance. Bowlby argued that this attunement does not disappear when we grow up, it goes underground. It operates beneath the rational layer. It continues to gather data and communicate that data to us through anxiety, through unease, through the inexplicable certainty that something is wrong in a room where everything looks fine. Jung would have agreed. He spent years documenting what he called the inferior feeling function, the way that emotional intelligence, when not valued and developed, continues to operate beneath consciousness, surfacing as mood, physical tension, sudden aversion, or the kind of dream that leaves you unsettled all morning without knowing why. The person who feels what others miss is often not someone with extraordinary powers. They are often simply someone who never fully completed the childhood training in what to ignore. Some of that training is necessary. You cannot function in adult life while attending to every emotional nuance of every person in every room. The filter has a purpose, but the filter can also cut out too much. James Hillman, the American psychologist who studied with Jung in Zurich in the 1950s and spent his career expanding Jungian thought, wrote in The Soul's Code that many people who present with depression, fatigue, and a vague sense of wrongness are not suffering from a deficit, they are suffering from overfull attention, a nervous system that has taken in more than the culture has given them permission to process. You sit with a feeling for days that no one else in the room seems to have noticed. Was it real? Jung's answer, across decades of clinical work, was almost always yes. The feeling was real. The question was what to do with it. The answer was not to get rid of it. The answer was to learn to read it. A small thing worth noticing. The people who feel what others miss are rarely wrong about what they sense. What they are often wrong about is what it means. They sense that someone in the room is angry and they assume it is directed at them. They feel the emotional weather of a situation and they locate themselves as the cause. That is the error, not the sensing, the locating. We will spend time with that distinction tonight. It is one of the most practically useful things Jung left behind. Let your shoulders drop. For now, just know this. The quality of attention you have, the one that keeps you awake right now, long after others have gone quiet, is not a malfunction. It is a capacity. It has simply been carrying more than it was designed to carry alone. Idea by idea tonight, we begin to distribute the weight. Chapter 5, The Gift That Feels Like Burden. Virginia Woolf kept diaries from 1915 until 1941. 26 years of almost daily entries. They have been published in 5 volumes, and if you read them slowly, not for plot, not for gossip about the Bloomsbury Group, but for what they reveal about a particular kind of mind, they are among the most precise accounts ever written of what it is like to feel everything. She writes about arriving at a dinner party in London in 1922 and being unable to eat because she was so preoccupied with the tension between 2 people across the table. A tension, she noted, that no one else appeared to register. She spent the rest of that evening processing something that had not involved her at all. She called it seeing too much. She returned to the phrase many times. Not as complaint, exactly as observation. Jung was aware of Woolf's work. He was aware, more broadly, of a quality that certain people carried that made them both more perceptive and more vulnerable than others. He did not believe these two things were separable. The gift and the burden were the same thing, expressing through different circumstances. In Psychological Types, he described the feeling function not as an emotion in the popular sense, not as crying at films or being easily offended, but as a mode of valuation. The feeling type, he wrote, evaluates experience not primarily through logic, but through a refined sense of worth, significance, and relational truth. This sounds abstract until you put it in a room. A meeting 1965. A manager is presenting a proposal. The logic is impeccable. The numbers are clean. But one person at the table feels, without being able to say exactly why, that the proposal is wrong. Not mathematically wrong. Wrong in a way that will matter later. A wrongness of proportion, of consequence, of something unaccounted for that the numbers cannot see. She says nothing. She has learned over many years that her kind of knowing is not the kind that gets called evidence. The proposal goes forward. 6 months later, the thing she felt turns out to be real. This is not a story about vindication. Jung was not interested in vindication. He was interested in the cost of silencing that kind of knowing, both for the individual who carries it and for the organizations and relationships that lose access to it. Elaine Aron, in her 1996 research, documented what she called the royal advisor archetype, the highly sensitive person who has historically served a function in their community not by leading from the front, but by perceiving what the leaders could not. The scout who reads the terrain, the counselor who reads the room, the person who says something is wrong here before the wrong thing has a name. In cultures that valued this function, the gift was recognized as a gift. In cultures that don't, and the current industrial culture is not especially good at this, the gift becomes invisible, and the person carrying it becomes simply someone who is hard to read, too quiet, too much in their own head. That invisibility has a cost. Jung saw it in his consulting room throughout his career. People who had spent 30, 40 years treating their most natural mode of perception as a liability, not suppressing it. You cannot suppress it entirely, but apologizing for it, hiding it, routing it underground where it came out sideways as anxiety, as chronic low-grade sadness, as the sense that everyone else knew how to be in the world in a way they had never quite managed. The room where they first sat down with Jung, the relief of being told this is a function, it has a name, it can be understood. Nothing you hear tonight requires anything of you. Just let the weight of that settle for a moment. You were not made wrong. You were made for a kind of knowing that the world around you has not always known how to receive. We continue. Chapter 6. Intuition before explanation. In the winter of 1913, Carl Jung stopped writing theoretical papers. He had just turned 38. He had broken with Freud. He had resigned from his position at the University of Zurich. And something had begun to happen inside him that he could not account for. He heard voices. He saw images. He had waking visions of floods covering Europe, floods of blood and mud and broken civilization. He was frightened. He knew enough psychiatry to know that these experiences in a patient would concern him. He decided not to call them symptoms. Instead, he sat with them. In the evenings, after his patients had gone, after his family had gone to bed in the large stone house at Kusnacht, he descended into what he called the confrontation with the unconscious. He wrote down what he saw. He painted it. He built it out of stones on the shore of the lake, like a child making a village. What he produced eventually became the Red Book, an illuminated manuscript that he showed almost no one for 60 years. It was published only in 2009, long after his death. The Red Book is not a theoretical text. It is a record of what happened when one of the 20th century's most rigorous scientific minds allowed itself to be led by intuition. Jung distinguished carefully between feeling and intuition in his typology. Feeling evaluates the worth of what is present. Intuition perceives what is not yet visible, the possibilities latent in the situation, the direction something is moving before it arrives. But in the sensitive person, these two functions are often closely linked. The feeling of wrong in a room often arrives before the evidence. The sense that something important is being left unsaid precedes any articulation. The unease before the event. We call this gut feeling, and we are often embarrassed by it. We shouldn't be. Antonio Damasio, the Portuguese-American neuroscientist, published Descartes' Error in 1994. It was not a Jungian text. It was hard neuroscience. But it documented something Jung would have recognized immediately. The patients who had damaged the connection between the rational prefrontal cortex and the emotional centers of the brain were not, as one might expect, more rational. They were worse at decisions. They could analyze every option. They could not choose. The feeling, Damasio argued, is not noise added on top of the signal. In many cases, it is the signal. Jung had argued this 70 years earlier from the clinic rather than the lab. The person who feels what others don't is not feeling instead of thinking. They are thinking with a different instrument, one that processes social, emotional, and relational data at a speed that rational analysis cannot match. The trouble is that this instrument is hard to explain to people who don't use it in the same way. Marcel Proust, writing in Paris in the early decades of the 20th century, described what he called involuntary memory. The sudden, total recall of a past experience triggered by a smell, a sound, a quality of light. This is intuition operating through sensation. The body holds what the mind has stored and retrieves it without being asked. The sensitive person is often described as living in the past. What they are actually doing is listening to it. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Jung spent 2 years following his intuitions into territory that no systematic theory could map. He emerged from that period with what became the foundation of analytical psychology. Not because the visions were literally true, but because attending to them taught him something about the structure of the psyche that a more cautious approach would not have reached. Intuition before explanation. Tonight, we are not being asked to explain anything, just to follow the thread, slowly, for as long as it holds. Chapter 7. Anxiety in the Attuned Mind. Søren Kierkegaard wrote The Concept of Anxiety in 1844 in Copenhagen when he was 31 years old. He had broken an engagement, retreated from the social life of the city, and was spending long hours alone with his thoughts. He wrote that anxiety was not, as commonly assumed, a fear of something. It was something subtler and more fundamental, the dizziness of freedom. The feeling that arises when you recognize, even dimly, that you must choose, that nothing is fixed, that the person you are is not the person you must remain, that the future is open in a way that cannot be closed. This, he argued, is not an illness. It is what consciousness feels like when it takes itself seriously. Jung read Kierkegaard carefully. He agreed on the fundamentals. And he added a clinical observation. The people who experience the most intense anxiety are often the people with the most finely developed perceptual sensitivity. Not because anxiety is a mark of intelligence, but because a sensitive nervous system registers ambiguity, threat, and complexity before it has been resolved into clear information. You feel the anxiety before you know what it is about. You feel something is wrong before anything has technically gone wrong. You sense the argument coming before the first sharp word. You lie awake after a conversation that seemed fine because something in it did not quite settle. This is not pathology. This is what a sensitive nervous system does. It is running continuous environmental scans, picking up signals that most people's filters exclude, and presenting those signals as feeling before they have been processed into thought. The problem is what happens next. Most people, when they feel anxiety they cannot explain, either look for a cause and, if they cannot find one, conclude something is wrong with them or try to suppress the feeling, which does not make it go away. It makes it louder in different rooms. Jung's approach was different. He was interested in what the anxiety was pointing to. Bessel van der Kolk, the Dutch-American psychiatrist who published The Body Keeps the Score in 2014, documented what happens to the nervous system when it has been running on high alert for a long time. The early warning system becomes the default system. The body that was designed to alert you to danger in the present moment begins to generate danger signals in the absence of actual danger. because the signal-generating capacity has been reinforced through years of use. This is not weakness. It is the body doing exactly what it was designed to do, for longer than the original design intended. For the sensitive person, the alert system was never calibrated for the volume of data it was asked to process. You were not built wrong. You were built for a quieter world. The room at night, the weight in the chest, the mind running through the day's conversations, not because you are neurotic, but because your nervous system is still at work, still sorting, still trying to make sense of what it took in. Let your jaw soften. Kierkegaard's remedy for the dizziness of freedom was not to eliminate the anxiety. It was to learn to stand in it, to develop what he called the courage of inwardness, the willingness to keep one's feet on the ground while the vertigo moved through. Jung's clinical version of this was simpler. Attend to the anxiety without feeding it. Notice it the way you would notice weather, without adding interpretation, without adding story. Just, there is wind tonight. The wind is not about me. The attuned mind does not need to stop feeling. It needs to learn to sit with feeling without immediately demanding that it means something. That is tonight's slow work. We keep going. Chapter 8. Emotional pain without witnesses. There is a particular loneliness that belongs almost exclusively to the sensitive person. It is not the loneliness of isolation, of being physically alone without people. Many sensitive people are surrounded by people. They are loved. They have careers, families, friendships. But there is something they carry that has no witnesses. A conversation with a parent 20 years ago that left a mark so subtle no one else in the room would have named it as harm. A birthday dinner that felt, beneath the candles and the laughter, shot through with a sadness no one acknowledged. A workplace friendship that quietly dissolved, not through argument, but through a slow accumulation of small moments that felt wrong and were impossible to name. The sensitive person felt all of it, clearly, in real time, and because it had no name and no one to confirm it, they often concluded one of two things: that the feeling was wrong or that they were. Donald Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst who worked in London through the mid-20th century, wrote about what he called the unwitnessed self, the parts of the child's inner experience that were never adequately reflected by the people around them. Not due to cruelty, usually, due to the limitations of people who were themselves not seen. When an experience is never witnessed, it does not disappear. It goes into what Jung would call the shadow, the repository of everything we have become convinced is unacceptable. Not unacceptable to the world, exactly. Unacceptable to the version of ourselves we present to the world. For the sensitive person, the shadow often contains not sins but perceptions. The feeling you had in that room that you were not allowed to report. The knowing that was too inconvenient to acknowledge. The grief you felt over something no one else counted as a loss. You buried the perception because there was no one to hold it with you. And something happens when we bury perception. Jung spent much of his career studying that something. He observed in his patients and in himself that what is denied consciousness does not remain silent. It returns as depression, as physical symptoms, as a pervasive sense of unreality, the feeling that you are somehow not quite present in your own life, because part of you is in the room where the thing happened that was never witnessed. The philosopher and theologian Martin Buber wrote, "In 1923 inches I and thou," about the difference between a world of I-it relations, in which we interact with people as objects, as means to ends, and I-thou relations, in which we encounter the full presence of another and are ourselves fully encountered. Buber argued that the I-thou moment is rare, and that the hunger for it is the deepest human longing. The sensitive person knows this hunger more acutely than most, because they have spent more time being in the presence of people who, despite caring for them, could not quite reach them, could not hold what they were actually feeling, could not say, "Yes, I see that. I saw it too." Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Winnicott also wrote about what he called good enough witnessing, not perfect mirroring, not the ideal audience for your inner life, just someone who stays present with you in the experience long enough for you to feel that it happened. Tonight can offer a version of that, not because I can see you, but because what we are describing tonight, this particular experience of feeling without witnesses, has been carried by enough people and studied seriously enough that you are not alone in it, even now. Jung's patients found this out. Many of them, he wrote, did not need solutions. They needed confirmation that what they had been carrying was real. It was real. It is real. We continue. Chapter 9. The Shadow of Sensitivity. If your mind has been drifting, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. Jung introduced the concept of the shadow in lectures and papers throughout the 1910s and 1920s. He meant by it not the part of the self that is evil, though it can contain that, but the part that is unseen, the part that does not fit the version of ourselves we have decided to present. For most people, the shadow contains the qualities they were taught to suppress, the anger that was not allowed in their family, the ambition that felt dangerous to admit, the selfishness they were shamed out of expressing. For the sensitive person, the shadow often contains something more surprising. It contains hardness, cynicism, contempt, impatience, the cold, clear-eyed assessment of other people that they have learned to hide because it does not match their self-image as empathetic, gentle, tuned in. The shadow of the deeply sensitive person is often a very effective judge. Jung was fascinated by this. He called it the enantiodromia, from the Greek, the tendency of a quality to flip into its opposite when pushed far enough. Water becomes ice. Devotion becomes resentment. Sensitivity, pushed to the extreme, begins to build beneath the surface a hard counterweight. The sensitive person who has spent years absorbing others' pain without relief often develops, without acknowledging it, a deep capacity for withdrawal, for shutting down, for looking at the person who is suffering and feeling not compassion, but a cold and private, "I cannot do this again." They are ashamed of that response. They should not be. Jung would call it the shadow asserting itself, the psyche saying, "You have given more than you have received." The part of you that has never been allowed a boundary is beginning to build one from underground. The shadow is not the enemy. It is the part of the self that was not given a legitimate channel. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the 1880s in Basel and later in his years of solitary wandering through Italy and Switzerland, described a type he called the man of ressentiment, the person who, unable to express power directly, turns it inward and then eventually outward in disguised forms, passive withdrawal, subtle sabotage. The capacity to wound with precision because they know exactly where the tender spots are. Jung took this seriously as a clinical phenomenon. He saw in his most sensitive patients the potential for this. Not because sensitivity makes people malicious, because sensitivity pushed underground, denied, never legitimately expressed, eventually finds illegitimate channels. The answer is not to become less sensitive. The answer is to integrate the hardness, to allow yourself to sometimes feel, "I am not available right now." Not always, not forever, but right now I need the room to myself. That is not a failure of compassion. That is the shadow given a legitimate channel. Let your shoulders drop. The shadow of sensitivity is usually just the part of you that stopped believing the world would ever make space for you to rest. So it stopped waiting for permission and started simply withdrawing. It was protecting you. It is not beautiful, exactly, but it is yours. And like everything in the shadow, once you can see it clearly, it loses its compulsive quality. You can choose then when to extend and when to withdraw. That is the difference between a reflex and a decision. We continue. Chapter 10. The persona that hides depth. Jung introduced the concept of the persona in Psychological Types in 1921. He borrowed the word from its original Latin meaning, the mask worn by actors in Roman theatre. A persona was a character, a role, something you put on to play a part. Jung argued that every adult develops a persona. It is a social necessity. You cannot show your full inner life in every professional, social, or casual encounter. The persona is the edited version of yourself you offer to the world, adapted to the setting, calibrated to the audience, shaped by what has been rewarded and what has been punished. The healthy persona is flexible. You wear it in the meeting and take it off at home. You know it is a persona, you do not confuse it for yourself. The problem arrives when the persona and the self become difficult to distinguish. For the sensitive person, this happens frequently. And it happens for a specific reason. The world's standard operating mode is not calibrated for depth. It rewards surface. It rewards the person who can summarize quickly, network efficiently, move from small talk to logistics to sign off in under 5 minutes. It rewards the persona that is smooth, competent, and undemanding. The sensitive person learns this early. They learn that the version of themselves that notices everything, that sits with things, that feels the weight of what others are carrying, is not always welcome in the room. So they build a persona that is welcome, reliable, steady, often warm, often competent, almost always more attuned to others' needs than to their own. It is an excellent persona, and it is, for many sensitive people, slowly exhausting. A Thursday afternoon, 1938, a woman in her late 40s sits in Jung's consulting room. She has had what the world would call an excellent life. Respected career, good marriage, children who love her. She cannot explain why she has been crying in her car before work each morning for 6 months. Jung asks her to describe the person she is at work. She does. It is a good description. Capable, organized, solution-oriented. He asks her to describe the person she is at 3 a.m. when she cannot sleep. She stops. Those two people, Jung tells her gently, have not met each other in a very long time. The persona that hides depth is not dishonest. It is a survival structure, built for good reasons, at a time when the real self had no safe container. Irvin Yalom, the American existential psychiatrist who practiced in California in the latter half of the 20th century, described patients who had lived their entire adult lives wearing a version of themselves that was not quite themselves. Not consciously, not through deliberate concealment. They had simply stopped checking. They had forgotten, somewhere in the business of being a functional person, to ask what they actually thought, what they actually wanted. What kind of room, what kind of conversation, what kind of life felt true rather than simply sustainable? Nothing you hear tonight is asking you to tear the persona down. Jung never recommended that. The persona serves a purpose. The meeting needs a competent person at the table. The mask is not the problem. The problem is only when you forget you are wearing it. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Right now, in this room, there is no meeting to attend, no version of yourself to perform, just the weight of you resting. Notice what that feels like. We keep going. Chapter 11, Why Crowds Feel Heavy. In 1921, the same year that Jung published Psychological Types, Gustave Le Bon's 1895 book, The Crowd, was being read in a second wave across Europe. Le Bon had argued that individuals in groups regress, that the rational, self-aware person becomes part of a collective organism, susceptible to emotional contagion in ways they would never accept alone. Jung read Le Bon. He agreed, in part, and he went further. He argued that group settings are not merely inhibiting to rational thought, they are actively altering to the psyche. When you enter a large group, a party, a conference, a train platform, a stadium, you are entering a field of unconscious material. The room does not just contain people. It contains their moods, their defenses, their unprocessed fears, their ambient hunger and frustration and longing. All of it is present. All of it is in the air. The sensitive person does not just observe this, they absorb it. This is what Jung's concept of psychic contagion describes. Not in the dismissive, vague sense in which the word energy is used loosely, but in a precise phenomenological sense. The attuned person has a permeable membrane. What is in the room gets in, not because they want it to, because their perceptual system is not filtering it. Elaine Aron documented this with precision in her 1996 research. Highly sensitive people, she found, consistently reported feeling depleted after social situations that others found energizing. Not because they were introverted in the popular sense of needing quiet to recharge, but because social situations presented more information than they could efficiently process in real time. The result is what you probably know as the feeling of being drained. It is not metaphor. Something actually happened. You processed more than others. You absorbed more. You leave with more in your system than you arrived with. Susan Cain, in Quiet, her 2012 account of introversion in a culture that prizes extroversion, describes the experience of highly sensitive people in professional settings as similar to working without noise-cancelling headphones in a room where others have them. Same conversation, different experience of the conversation. This is worth sitting with. You are not avoiding people because you dislike them. Most sensitive people are deeply interested in people. They find people fascinating, beautiful, occasionally infuriating, and always compelling. They leave social situations depleted because they were paying attention at a level that is simply more expensive. A gathering, 1931, Zurich. Jung is in his late 50s. Someone at a dinner asks him what he does to restore himself after a difficult clinical day. He says, he goes to his stone house at Bollingen on the upper end of Lake Zurich. He built it himself over years. It has no electricity, no telephone, just the lake, the fire, the stone walls. He is not running from people. He is returning to himself. The room where you are lying tonight is not a failure. It is a return. Let your jaw soften. The weight you carried home from the last gathering you attended, all the atmospheric data, the unspoken tensions, the moods that moved through the room and settled in you before you even sat down. None of it belongs to you. You can put it down. Not by solving it or understanding it, by simply letting the body release what it never asked to hold. That is what sleep is for. The sensitive person who sleeps well is not one who has stopped feeling. They are one who has learned to put down, at the end of the day, the feelings that were not theirs to begin with. We are working toward that. Chapter 12. The Inner Critic of Difference. Every sensitive person at some point in childhood received the message that the way they experienced the world was too much. Too emotional, too serious, too quiet, too particular, too slow to answer, too quick to feel, too hard to understand. The message came in different forms, sometimes through outright criticism, sometimes through the more subtle pressure of watching others move through situations that overwhelmed you with apparent ease. Sometimes through humor, the kind that signals, without quite saying, that your response is more than the occasion calls for. Children are extraordinarily responsive to these signals. They do not need to be told directly. They observe, they absorb, they adapt. What the sensitive child adapts to over years is a set of internal rules about what is acceptable to feel and what must be hidden. And that set of rules becomes, in adulthood, the inner critic. Alfred Adler, the Austrian psychiatrist who was, like Jung, among Freud's earliest close colleagues before striking out on his own, described what he called the inferiority complex, the entrenched belief originating in childhood experience that one is fundamentally deficient in relation to others. Jung took this concept and complicated it. He noted that in sensitive people, the inferiority feeling was often attached not to an actual deficiency, but to a genuine difference that had been coded as deficiency by the people around them. You were not slow, you were thorough. You were not oversensitive. You were accurate. You were not hard to understand. You were simply in a room with people who were not trying very hard to understand you. But the inner critic, once established, does not make these distinctions. The inner critic speaks in the voice of whoever installed it, a parent, a teacher, a sibling, a first boss. And it delivers its verdict not as an opinion, but as a fact. You are too much. You feel too much. You need too much. Ethan Kross, the American psychologist who published Chatter in 2021, spent years studying this inner voice, its content, its tone, its effects on performance and well-being. He found that one of the most effective ways to change its impact is to create distance from it, to move from I language to observational language. Not I am too much, but there is a voice here saying too much, and it learned that a long time ago. The voice is not you. It is an adaptation. It learned to preempt the criticism by delivering it first, by maintaining such a rigorous internal standard that no external rejection could be worse than what was already being said from inside. This is actually a form of intelligence. It kept you safe, in a way, from the vulnerability of being surprised by other people's judgment. But it is no longer necessary. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. The inner critic of difference is almost always in exile from the truth of the matter. The truth is not that you felt too much. The truth is that the people around you at a particular time did not have the capacity to receive what you were actually offering. That is their limitation. You have been paying for it ever since. Tonight, we start putting that ledger down. We continue. Chapter 13. Projection in every room. There is a mechanism Jung described that is so common in sensitive people that it is almost diagnostic. He called it projection. He meant it in a specific technical sense, not the casual use of the word, which has become somewhat loose in popular psychology. He meant the unconscious attribution of one's own inner material to an external figure. The process by which something that belongs to you gets seen as belonging to someone else. We all project. It is a basic feature of human psychology. But the sensitive person projects in a particular way, and the consequences are particular. Because the sensitive person is so attuned to others, they often experience their own projections, not as obviously distorted the way someone in full projection might see an enemy everywhere, but as exquisitely plausible readings of the other person. You walk into a room and feel that a certain person is angry. You read their body language, their tone, the set of their shoulders. You build a case. The case is sophisticated. You have, after all, a great deal of data. And sometimes the case is correct. But sometimes you are reading something in them that belongs to you. The anger is yours. Or more precisely, the unacknowledged anger that lives in your shadow, the anger you have not permitted yourself to feel, is being located in the other person because it cannot be tolerated in yourself. Jung's clinical notebooks from the early decades of his practice at Kusnacht are full of these observations. A patient who was convinced her sister despised her, who could read contempt in every interaction, who had, Jung eventually observed, an enormous and completely suppressed contempt of her own for the life she had chosen, for the compromises she had made that had nowhere to go, and so travelled the easier route of settling into the nearest available object. The sister was not entirely blameless. People rarely are. But the intensity of what the patient felt, the certainty, the suffocating quality of the conviction that belonged to what she was carrying. Projection is not a character flaw. It is the mind's attempt to make the bearable bearable. If the anger I feel toward my life is located in my sister, I do not have to face the choices that made me angry. The problem is outside me. It can, in theory, be resolved. The problem is that it cannot be resolved because it was never outside to begin with. Marie-Louise von Franz, in her 1974 work Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales, described the experience of seeing through projection as one of the most uncomfortable and liberating experiences available to the psyche. Uncomfortable, because when the projection is withdrawn, you are left holding something that was apparently yours all along. Liberating, because you can actually do something with what belongs to you. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. This is offered without judgment. You are not wrong for having projected. You are human. The room you are in tonight is full of things that may belong to you rather than to the people you assigned them to. That is not a condemnation. It is an opening. We continue. Chapter 14. when others cannot feel. There is a conversation that many sensitive people have rehearsed so many times in their own minds that it has taken on the quality of myth. It is the conversation in which they try to explain to someone they love what it is like to feel the way they feel. Not dramatically, not to extract sympathy, but simply to be understood. And the person they love, genuinely loving them, genuinely present, genuinely trying, looks at them with an expression that is a mixture of care and confusion, and says something like, "I don't really understand what you mean. Can you be more specific?" Or, "I'm sure it will pass." Or, most reliably devastating, "You think too much." And the conversation ends, not in rupture, but in the quiet closing of a door. This is not a failure of love. It is a failure of translation. Jung was aware of this failure. He spent years developing his typology. Not, he always insisted, to create a hierarchy of better and worse types, but to provide a language through which people of genuinely different psychological constitutions could understand the nature of their differences. He was working against a tendency that exists in all of us, to assume that our own mode of experiencing is the correct one, and that people who experience differently are either in error or in need of correction. The person who does not feel what the sensitive person feels is not, in Jung's view, deficient. They are organized differently. Their perceptual filter is calibrated differently. The information that moves the sensitive person is simply not the information that their nervous system is primed to prioritize. This is genuinely different from indifference. There is a distinction worth holding tonight between the person who cannot feel what you feel and the person who will not. The first is a limitation of constitution. The second is a choice. Most of the people who have failed to receive what the sensitive person was offering were in the first category. They were not withholding. They were not punishing. They simply did not have access to the frequency. This realization, when it arrives clearly, is both painful and relieving. Painful because it means the longing for that person to finally understand is a longing for them to become someone they cannot become. Relieving because it means the failure was never evidence that what you were feeling was wrong. The astronomer does not ask the violinist to confirm the existence of a galaxy. The galaxy exists regardless of whether the violinist can see it through the telescope. William James, lecturing in Boston in 1906 on what he called the varieties of religious experience, made a point that has since been applied far beyond its original context: that the existence of an experience cannot be judged by whether others share it. The experience is real to the one who has it. Its reality does not require consensus. Let your jaw soften. The things you have felt that no one confirmed were still real. The perception that went unwitnessed was still accurate. The feeling in the room that no one else acknowledged was still there. You are not required to get permission to know what you know. We continue. Chapter 15. Childhood Lessons in Silence. There is a piece of research from the 1970s conducted by the developmental psychologist Ed Tronick at Harvard that changed how child psychologists understood infant perception. Tronick developed what he called the still face experiment, an experiment simple in design and devastating in implication. A mother faces her infant. They are playing, making faces, laughing, pointing at things. The child is responsive, alert, happy. Then, at a signal, the mother makes her face completely blank, neutral, still. The child notices immediately. Within seconds, they try to re-engage, pointing, reaching, making noises. The mother stays still. Within 90 seconds, infants in the experiment show signs of significant distress. Some look away, some collapse inward. What Tronick documented was that very young children are not responding to the content of their caregiver's communication. They are responding to its emotional quality. They are reading the room before they can speak. They are, as John Bowlby would have put it, running their primary attunement at full capacity. For the child who grows up in a household where the emotional atmosphere is inconsistent, where warmth arrives unpredictably, where a parent's mood determines whether a feeling is safe to express, the early lessons are particularly acute. You learn to read the room before you enter it. You develop, without instruction, an early warning system for emotional weather. You become very good at sensing what is needed and calibrating your behavior accordingly. You become, in other words, a highly attuned child. This is adaptive. In the household where you developed it, it was a survival skill. The problem is that it travels with you. 40 years later, you are doing the same scan in a business meeting, in a restaurant with a friend, in a bedroom with the lights off. You are still reading rooms. You have already been given permission to stop reading. Jung described what he called the parental complex, not as a blame, but as a factual observation. The earliest relational patterns become templates. They are not inescapable, but they are persistent, because they were laid down before there was language to contest them. The sensitive child who learned to be quiet about their perceptions in order to maintain peace did not do so voluntarily. They did so because the alternative, naming what they were actually feeling in a room that could not hold it, was too costly. And so they learned silence. Not the silence of acceptance, the silence of management, containing what they felt in order to make the room work. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. That management had a cost. The contained perceptions did not disappear. They were stored. And sometimes in a room very much like this one, dark, quiet, the world gone still, they resurface. Not as crises, as a gentle pressure, as the weight you carry before you fall asleep. The child who learned silence was learning how to survive in a particular environment. You are in a different environment now. The silence here is different. This silence is spacious enough to put things down. We continue. Chapter 16. The wound of being too open. If your mind has been wandering, come back gently. You don't need to have followed every word. The parts that matter will find you. There is a particular kind of wound that has no scar. No event you can point to. No clear before and after. Just a gradual learning, beginning very young and continuing for years. That the way you experience the world made other people uncomfortable. Not unkind, many of these people, not malicious, simply unable to match the depth you were offering. And in the absence of a match, they reflected back subtly and persistently that depth itself was the problem. That you were too open, too available, too raw, too unguarded in a way that demanded more than the situation could hold. And so you closed, gradually, incrementally, not by decision, but by adjustment. You learned to hold things back, to arrive at a gathering already edited, to offer the version of yourself that would not require anything from the room. This is not dishonesty. It is protection, but it is also a loss. Jung described this closing in his concept of individuation, the lifelong process by which a person becomes, slowly and through considerable difficulty, more fully themselves. He observed that many people enter the second half of life having successfully adapted to the world, but at the cost of significant contact with their own interior. They have built a good persona. They have met the world's expectations. They have been, by every external measure, successful. And they arrive in his consulting room, or in some equivalent moment of stillness, with the uncomfortable awareness that they do not quite know who they are behind all of that. The wound of being too open is the wound of having decided, at some point, that openness itself was the liability. Rainer Maria Rilke, the Bohemian Austrian poet who spent much of his adult life moving between Paris and the German-speaking world in the early decades of the 20th century, wrote to a young poet in 1903, a series of letters now collected as Letters to a Young Poet. In one of them, he wrote about the difficulty of living with a great interior life in a world that does not always have space for it. His advice was not to close the interior life to match the world. His advice was to find and protect the spaces in which the interior could breathe. The rooms where openness is not a liability. The friendships in which depth is not an embarrassment. The solitary hours in which what you actually feel does not need to be managed. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. Those spaces are not a retreat from life. They are, for the sensitive person, the condition under which life becomes sustainable. The wound of having been too open was inflicted in rooms that could not hold you. You were not wrong to be open. You were simply in the wrong rooms. We keep going. Chapter 17. Empathy and Unconscious Contagion. In the mid-2000s, a group of neuroscientists at the University of Parma published research on what they called mirror neurons, cells in the premotor cortex that fire both when an animal performs an action and when it observes the same action being performed by another. The popular account of mirror neurons was often overstated. Neuroscience is rarely as clean as its popularization suggests. But the underlying phenomenon the researchers were pointing to is real and well documented. The human nervous system is built to resonate with other nervous systems. When you watch someone in pain, your nervous system activates some of the same responses as if you were in pain. When you watch someone laughing genuinely, the neural patterns of amusement begin to fire in you. When you enter a room full of anxious people, your body registers anxiety even before your conscious mind has assessed the situation. This is the biological basis of empathy. For the sensitive person, this resonance system appears to be running at higher gain. More input is registered, more resonance occurs, more of what is in the room comes in. Jung called this unconscious contagion. He described it in his 1936 essay, The Concept of the Collective Unconscious, as one of the primary ways that emotional material moves between people, not through communication, but through a kind of psychic osmosis that operates below the level of conscious awareness. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was describing something he had observed directly in his clinical practice, that patients and therapists influence each other's unconscious processes in ways that neither party can entirely account for. He recommended, on the basis of this, that every practicing analyst undergo their own analysis, not to fix themselves, but to know what was theirs so that they could distinguish it from what arrived from the patient. This is exactly what the sensitive person needs in everyday life. Some reliable way to distinguish what is theirs from what has arrived from the room. It is harder than it sounds. The emotional contagion is seamless. There is no obvious seam where your anxiety ends and the other person's begins. There is no label on the grief you are carrying that says, "This belongs to the person who sat next to you on the train this morning, not to you." You just feel it. Let your shoulders drop. Bessel van der Kolk, writing in The Body Keeps the Score, describes the experience of people with high empathic sensitivity as similar to living without a membrane. The world comes in unfiltered. This is both a gift and a form of suffering that people without the experience genuinely cannot imagine. But the membrane can be developed not by becoming less sensitive, by becoming more skilled at returning to yourself after exposure to what is not yours. A practice as simple as this. At the end of a day, or a gathering, or a difficult conversation, ask, what of what I am carrying right now was already mine when I arrived? The rest you can put down, not through effort, through recognition. If it isn't yours, it doesn't require carrying. We continue. Chapter 18. Overthinking after human contact. There is a particular experience that almost every sensitive person recognizes, though they may have no name for it. You finish a conversation, a reasonably ordinary conversation with a friend, a colleague, someone at the counter of a shop you go to regularly, you leave. And then, for the next hour, sometimes for the rest of the day, the conversation runs in your mind. Not because anything went wrong, not because you said something you regret, But because the conversation was full of data that you did not have time to process in the moment, and your mind is now in the quiet of the aftermath, doing the work that social context didn't allow. What did they mean by that slight pause before they answered? Was the warmth at the beginning slightly more formal than usual? Was the ending of the conversation abrupt? And if so, is it significant? You run the variables. You construct hypotheses. You test them against memory. You run them again. This is not anxiety in the clinical sense. It is the nervous system finishing its processing of a complex data set. The problem is that the data set keeps expanding. Jung described this process, though not in these terms, in his observations of patients who were, as he called it, extroverted in feeling, highly attuned to the relational field, constantly monitoring and interpreting the signals others sent, unable to fully rest until the social situation had been resolved to some internal standard. He noted that the resolution was often impossible to achieve through the analysis itself. The mind that is running the conversation again is not going to find what it is looking for by running it one more time. What it is actually looking for is a felt sense of safety. A bodily certainty that the connection is intact, that the other person is not withdrawing, that the world the sensitive person has carefully built around their relationships is not in danger. That felt sense cannot arrive through analysis. It arrives through the body settling. Abraham Maslow, the American psychologist who developed his hierarchy of needs in the 1940s, placed what he called belongingness at the center of human motivation. Beneath self-actualization, beneath esteem, as one of the bedrock needs without which higher development cannot reliably proceed. The sensitive person monitors for threats to belonging with the vigilance of someone who knows from experience that belonging is not guaranteed. The overthinking after human contact is love's anxiety. It is the attuned person running a check. Are we still connected? Did I do something wrong? Is everything okay? Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. Jung's answer to this was not to stop caring about connection. It was to develop what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between the relational need and the rational awareness, that the anxiety is not based on real evidence. Not to suppress one in favor of the other, to hold both and let the tension resolve itself. The conversation ended. The person did not withdraw. You were present, and so were they. What happened after the conversation was processing. It is complete now. You can rest. Chapter 19. Complexes beneath sensitivity. Jung introduced the concept of the complex in his earliest published research. The word association experiments conducted at the Berg-Halsey Clinic in Zurich between 1904 and 1909. The experiments were methodologically simple. A list of words spoken one at a time to a patient who had to respond with the first word that came to mind. The experimenter measured response times and noted irregularities. What Jung found was that certain words caused significant delays or unusual responses. The patient would hesitate, give a strange answer, sometimes forget the instructions entirely. These irregularities clustered around particular emotional themes he called the clusters complexes. Not complexes in the popular sense, not he has a complex about authority as casual shorthand. A complex, in the technical Jungian sense, is an autonomous collection of images, feelings, and memories organized around an emotional core. It operates semi-independently of the ego. It has its own logic, its own agenda, its own history. When a complex is activated, it does not feel like a complex. It feels like reality. You are not thinking about your fear of abandonment. You are simply experiencing this conversation as confirmation that you are about to be left. The two things feel exactly the same from the inside. For the sensitive person, complexes are activated more readily than for others. Because the sensitive person is processing more emotional data, there are more potential triggers in any given room. The complex spots the pattern before the ego has a chance to evaluate whether the pattern is real. The result is a kind of hair trigger that fires at partial matches. A tone of voice that sounds slightly like a parent's disapproval. A silence that lasts a beat longer than feels comfortable. A compliment that arrives with a quality that seems, beneath the words, slightly conditional. The complex fires. The old emotion arrives. And now you are responding not to what is happening, but to what happened once before. James Hillman, in Revisioning Psychology, published in 1975, argued that the complexes are not problems to be eliminated, but characters to be known. They are the psyche's way of organizing its history. Each complex is, in a sense, a story the psyche is still living inside. To be free of a complex is not to erase it. It is to become conscious of it. To be able to say, this is an old story. It is being triggered right now by something that resembles the original situation. But I am not in the original situation. The room I am in now is not the room from then. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The sensitivity that makes you more susceptible to complex activation is the same sensitivity that, when turned inward with some patience, can recognize the activation as it is happening. You learn to feel the complex arriving, the slight shift in emotional temperature, the sudden weight that has no clear current cause, the certainty that something is wrong that arrives faster than evidence can account for. And then gently you ask, is this now or is this then? That question alone changes the nature of the experience. We continue. Chapter 20. The nervous system of meaning. There is a phenomenon that Viktor Frankl documented in his years at Auschwitz and Dachau between 1942 and 1945 that has continued to interest psychologists for the 8 decades since. He observed that the capacity to find meaning, even in conditions of maximum suffering, was not randomly distributed among the prisoners. It appeared to correlate with something that was difficult to measure but impossible to miss, a kind of depth of engagement with life that some people carried and others did not. The people who survived the camps, he wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, were not always the strongest physically. They were not always the most strategically shrewd. They were often the people who had something that required their continued existence, a task, a person, a question that had not yet been answered. He was describing what Jung would call the individuation drive, the psyche's deep orientation toward wholeness and meaning. Its refusal to accept that experience is merely what happens. The sensitive person has this drive turned up. They do not move through their days at the surface of experience. They are constantly in contact with the question of what it means, what this conversation means, what this feeling means, what the day as a whole was about beneath the logistics and the interactions and the things accomplished. This is not neurosis. This is the nervous system of meaning. The psychic apparatus built not just to process sensory input, but to locate significance within it. But meaning-seeking, when it runs continuously and without rest, becomes exhausting in its own way. The sensitive person who cannot settle at night is often not afraid of anything specific. They are still trying to understand what today meant. They are still sorting the day's data into significance and non-significance, still looking for the pattern, still trying to arrive at a coherent account of their own experience. The mind wants a conclusion, and the day, most days, does not offer one. William Blake, the English poet and visionary artist who lived in London between 1757 and 1827, wrote in his prophetic books about what he called the human form divine, the capacity for perception that goes beyond the surface of things. He was not a psychologist, he was a poet. But he was describing something Jung would recognize, the mind that sees through the literal into the symbolic. That cannot look at a tree without the tree meaning something. This is a gift. It is also a hunger that cannot be fully fed. Let your jaw soften. Frankl's prescription for meaning, the one he developed from his own survival and his subsequent decades of clinical work, was not to find the meaning of life in the abstract. It was to find it in the specific, in the particular task, the particular person, the particular moment that called for a response. Not the meaning of today, the meaning of this breath, the meaning of the weight of your body resting in this room after a day of sustained and attentive living. That is enough. That is, perhaps, exactly enough. We continue. Chapter 21. Why certain people disturb you. There is a specific experience that Jung wrote about in his private correspondence and in his later clinical work that the sensitive person will recognize without prompting. You meet someone, or you are in regular contact with someone, and they disturb you in a way that is disproportionate to their apparent threat. They may be perfectly civil, they may be objectively harmless, they may even be liked by everyone around you. But something about them puts you on edge, a quality you cannot name, a way they take up space in a room, a tone beneath their words, an atmosphere they carry. You find yourself thinking about them more than the situation warrants, replaying conversations, feeling in their presence slightly off balance. Jung called this phenomenon the constellation of the complex. The disturbing person is not disturbing because of who they are disturbing because they have activated something in you. They carry a quality, a tone of contempt, or unearned authority, or beautiful fragility, or dangerous charisma that corresponds to a figure in your own unconscious that has not been integrated. The technical name for the unconscious figure is the shadow. But more specifically, in this context, Jung was often describing what he called the anima or animus, the contrasexual aspect of the psyche. The figure representing qualities the individual has assigned to the other and therefore denied in themselves. But let us stay with a simpler formulation for tonight. The person who disturbs you is carrying something that belongs to a part of you that is not yet in relationship with consciousness. This is not pathology, it is the psyche's way of pointing. A woman enters a conference room in 1934. She is 42. She has been in therapy with Jung for 2 years. She tells him that she has developed an irrational hostility toward a particular colleague at work. The colleague is, by all accounts, competent and well regarded. The hostility arrives suddenly and without cause. Jung asks her to describe the colleague precisely. She describes self-possessed, assured, seemingly at ease with her own opinions, never apologizes unnecessarily. Jung asks, are these qualities you recognize in yourself? Long silence. She says, I think I was taught that these qualities were not available to me. This is the work. The disturbing person is not a problem to be managed. They are a question being asked from the depths of your own psyche about something you have not yet been willing to integrate. This is uncomfortable. It removes the simple satisfaction of the disturbing person simply being the disturbing person. It says, look inward before you look outward. Nothing you hear tonight is asking you to excuse the disturbing person's behavior. They may be genuinely difficult, they may be genuinely unkind. But the intensity of your response is yours to examine. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. The quality that disturbs you most reliably in others is usually the quality that lives in your own shadow, waiting for permission to become conscious. Not as an accusation, as an invitation. We continue. Chapter 22. Dreams of Unspoken Feeling. Jung worked with dreams for 60 years. Not as a hobbyist, not as a mystic pursuing hidden knowledge, as a clinician who believed that the dream, nightly, unbidden, produced without effort by the sleeping psyche, was the most direct access available to the contents of the unconscious. He disagreed with Freud about what the dream was for. Freud saw the dream as a disguise, as the unconscious encoding its forbidden wishes in symbolic language precisely to prevent them from waking the sleeper. The dream as censor. Jung saw the dream differently. For him, the dream was a compensation. The dreaming mind presented what the waking mind had overlooked. It completed the day's picture. It added what consciousness had left out. And what consciousness most reliably leaves out for the sensitive person is what they could not say, the unspeakable things. Not in the dramatic sense, in the ordinary sense. The feeling you had that was too particular to name, the grief that had no occasion, the rage you could not locate, the longing that had no addressee. These things surface in dreams. The dream of the room that keeps getting larger, with doors that open onto other doors, and a voice somewhere ahead that you cannot quite reach. This is not a nightmare. It is the psyche mapping what it cannot yet access in waking life. The dream of the person you have not seen for years, not romantically, not nostalgically, but strangely present. The psyche returning to an unfinished business. A quality that person represented that you have not finished learning from. The dream of a house, almost always a house. Jung noted that the house in dreams represents the self. The rooms represent aspects of the psyche. The dream of an unexplored room in a known house is, in his reading, an encounter with an aspect of the self that has not yet been brought into conscious relationship. For the sensitive person, the unexplored room often contains exactly what they have been told is not acceptable. The feeling that was too much, the knowing that had no witness, the perception that was dismissed. It has been kept safe in the dream. Mary Oliver, the American poet who spent much of her life observing the natural world in Provincetown, Massachusetts, wrote in a 1994 essay about waking from a dream so vivid it seemed more real than the morning. She did not analyze it. She wrote that she sat with it the way one sits with a landscape, not trying to extract meaning, but simply being in its presence. This is one possible approach to the dream. Not interpretation, attention. Let your body settle. The dream tonight, whatever the psyche chooses to offer, is not a problem to be solved. It is the psyche's version of the conversation you could not have today. The unspoken feeling finds its form there. And in the morning, often something has shifted. Not because you understood it, because you gave it space. We continue. Chapter 23. Symbols of the Attuned Soul. Jung spent a significant portion of his later career studying what he called the symbolic life. He meant something precise by this. The way in which the unconscious communicates through images rather than through propositions, through form rather than through argument. He believed that certain symbols, images that appear across cultures, across centuries, across the individual dreams of people who have never encountered them in waking life, were evidence of what he called the collective unconscious, the deep shared layer of the human psyche that underlies individual experience. He was not claiming that people are born with specific memories. He was claiming that people are born with the capacity to generate and to respond to certain fundamental forms. The mandala, the circular, symmetrical pattern, appears in medieval Christian iconography in Tibetan Buddhist Thangka paintings, in the sand paintings of the Navajo, in the spontaneous drawings of patients who had never seen any of these traditions. Jung saw it as a symbol of wholeness, the psyche's representation of its own deepest aspiration, the serpent that sheds its skin, the journey into darkness that ends in return, the wounded healer, the wise old man at the edge of the forest. These images appear in the dreams of individuals, in the myths of cultures, in the literature of centuries. Jung argued that the sensitive person is often in closer contact with the symbolic level of experience than others, that what they feel in rooms and in relationships and in their own interior life is partly the activation of these deeper patterns. This is not mysticism. It is an empirical claim that can be verified simply by attending carefully to your own dream imagery over time. The sensitive person often carries, alongside their immediate emotional data, a symbolic layer that processes experience in image rather than in thought. The thing that happened today arrives in the body as something familiar, ancient, as if it has happened before, not in this life, but in some deeper frequency of human experience. This is the attuned soul in contact with what is below the personal. Rilke wrote in the Duino elegies composed between 1912 and 1922 about what he called the open, a state of being in which the boundary between self and world becomes permeable. Not dissolution, not the loss of self, but the state in which perception goes all the way through, from inside to outside, without resistance. He was describing in poetic terms what Jung described in clinical terms as the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to move between conscious and unconscious material without being overwhelmed by either. The symbol is the currency of this movement. Let your jaw soften. Tonight, in the space between waking and sleep, if an image surfaces, something strange or vivid or unexpectedly tender, you do not need to analyze it. Just let it be present. The attuned soul knows how to do this. It has always known. We continue. Chapter 24, Mental Health and Deep Perception. If your mind has drifted, that is fine. Come back gently. We are still here. There is a question that arises legitimately when we talk about the gift of sensitivity. Where is the line between perception and hypervigilance, between emotional attunement and anxiety disorder, between the depth that is a gift and the depth that has become a wound? Jung was a clinician. He did not romanticize the suffering of his patients. He was aware that the same sensitive constitution that produced visionary artists and excellent therapists and quietly extraordinary people also produced, in some circumstances, significant psychological suffering. He drew the distinction carefully between what he called the normal introvert and the neurotic introvert, not as a diagnosis of character, but as a description of degree. The sensitive person, who has developed what he called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold tension between inner and outer, between feeling and analysis, between depth and functionality is not neurotic. They are simply organized differently than the culture expects. The sensitive person who has not developed this capacity, and who has instead been living in one of two extremes, either absorbing everything without discrimination or defended against everything with thick walls, may need more than philosophy. They may need clinical support. This is not weakness. It is the appropriate response to a genuine challenge. Bessel van der Kolk, whose work we have returned to several times tonight, was emphatic about this, that for people whose nervous system has been significantly dysregulated by trauma, by chronic stress, by years of operating in fight or flight without relief, the entry point for healing is often the body, not the mind. Not talking about the experience. Feeling safe enough, first, to be in the body that carries it. This is work that benefits from skilled support. The ideas in tonight's script, the frameworks from Jung, the research from Aron and van der Kolk and Bowlby, and the others are offered as orientation, as a way of understanding what you carry and why. They are not a substitute for the professional relationship in which that understanding can be held by another person. If what you recognize in tonight's ideas carries weight that exceeds what reflection can hold, the next step is not more reflection. It is finding the room in which you can be held. That recommendation is made without diminishment. The most sensitive and perceptive people Jung worked with were often his most complex cases, not because their sensitivity made them fragile, but because their sensitivity meant they had more to hold and had been holding it alone for longer. You do not have to hold it alone. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. Tonight offers ideas, an orientation, a sense that what you carry has been noticed by people who spent their lives studying it, that is offered with care. We continue. Chapter 25. The difference between feeling and fantasy. Jung was careful about a distinction that is easily blurred. He believed profoundly in the validity of feeling as a mode of knowing. But he was also a clinician who had spent decades working with patients whose feeling function had become something else, not a mode of knowing, but a mode of creating. A system not for perceiving reality, but for generating an alternative one. He called this fantasy, in the negative sense, the use of the imagination not to illuminate reality, but to replace it. The difference is important. Feeling, as Jung described it, is relational. It orients toward what is actually present. It reads what is in the room. It processes data that is genuinely there. The attuned person who walks into a room full of anxious people and feels anxiety is performing a genuine perceptual act. The data is real. Fantasy, in this sense, is the activity of the psyche when it substitutes projected material for actual data, when what you feel in the room is not what is in the room, but what your own history has placed there. The person who is certain, on the basis of a slight hesitation in a colleague's response, that they are about to be fired, and whose certainty persists regardless of any evidence to the contrary, is not sensing. They are constructing. This is not a moral failing. It is what happens when the feeling function has been overwhelmed over time by material from the shadow, the complexes, the parental imago, the accumulated weight of what has not been processed. The feeling function stops reading the present and starts reading the past. The practical difference shows up in what the feeling responds to. Genuine perception can be updated. If the evidence changes, the feeling adjusts. You thought the room was hostile. Someone clarifies something, offers something, and the feeling shifts. You update. Fantasy cannot be updated. The emotional investment in the narrative is too great. The evidence that contradicts the story is absorbed into the story. The clarification becomes further evidence of the concern. Jung's clinical work, across 40 years of practice in Kusnacht, was substantially concerned with helping patients develop this distinction from the inside, not by dismissing their feeling, by helping them learn to distinguish the feeling that was tracking something real from the feeling that was running an old script. He called this process differentiation, the slow, careful work of learning which of your feelings are perceptions and which are productions. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. Tonight, you do not need to make this distinction. Not now. Not in the dark, before sleep. But it is worth knowing that the distinction exists. That feeling is not infallible. That the same sensitive system that reads rooms accurately can, under certain conditions, generate what it expects to find rather than what is there. That is not a reason to distrust your feeling. It is a reason to stay curious about it. The feeling is often right. And the practice of gently asking, is this now or then? Is this here or somewhere else? Is this signal or story? Keeps the system honest. We continue. Chapter 26, Loneliness of the Perceptive. There is a particular loneliness that belongs to the person who perceives what others do not. It is different from ordinary loneliness, from the loneliness of physical isolation, or from the loneliness of having no one who loves you. Many perceptive people have people who love them. Many are surrounded by warmth and intention and genuine care. But there is a frequency of experience that does not always have company. You sit in a meeting and feel the unacknowledged grief of the person presenting. No one else in the room reacts to it. The meeting proceeds. You carry the grief home without knowing why. You attend a family gathering and feel beneath the cheerfulness something strained and unresolved that goes back decades. You can almost see it. No one names it. The occasion ends. You lie awake. You are in a conversation with someone you love, and you sense, not from anything they say, but from the quality of the silence between sentences, that they are struggling in a way they are not yet ready to articulate. You wait. You try to make space. They smile and say they are fine. You believe them with the part of your mind that wants to believe them. The rest of you knows differently. and there is no place to put that knowledge. This is not loneliness in the romantic sense. It is loneliness of perception, the experience of carrying information that has no acceptable channel, of seeing clearly into situations that the people involved are not yet ready to look at directly. Nietzsche, writing in 1882 inches. The Gay Science, a book he composed in stages across several years of poor health and intense intellectual work in Genoa and Sils Maria in Switzerland, described what he called the problem of the truthful person. The person who sees clearly often sees things that other people find threatening. And the truthful person, faced with this, is given two options: to speak and be unwelcome, or to be silent and be alone. He did not pretend this was easy. He wrote about it with a kind of tender ferocity. Jung observed it clinically. Many of his patients who presented with depression were not, in his assessment, people who felt too little. They were people who felt too much and had been carrying that excess alone for too long, with no one to help them distribute the weight. The cure, if cure is even the right word, was not to feel less. It was to find or create the relational context in which what they felt could be shared, not necessarily resolved, simply witnessed. Martin Buber's I thou moment, the moment in which two people are fully present to each other. The sensitive person does not require this to be constant. They do not need every relationship to operate at full depth, but they do need it to exist somewhere. At least one room in the world where what they actually perceive can be brought without apology. Let your jaw soften. If that room does not yet fully exist in your life, tonight's ideas are not a substitute for it. But they are, perhaps, a signal that the loneliness has been noticed by people who studied it and by the many listeners who have found themselves here in the same dark room carrying the same particular weight. You are not alone in this. That is not a comfort exactly, but it is true. We continue. Chapter 27. The body notices first. There is a sequence that most people have experienced without naming it. Something happens in a room. A tone shifts, a look passes, a silence falls, slightly differently than usual. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could itemize in a report. And your body responds. A slight tightening in the chest. A change in the quality of your breath. A shift in the muscles of your shoulders or jaw. A vague sense of alertness that precedes any conscious assessment. You notice the body's response, and then you notice what caused it. In that sequence, the body is first. This is not metaphor. This is neurophysiology. The research of Joseph Ledoux, conducted at New York University through the 1980s and 1990s, documented what he called the subcortical route, the pathway by which sensory information reaches the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, before it reaches the cortex, where conscious analysis occurs. The body assessed the situation before you were aware there was a situation to assess. For the sensitive person, this response is running at higher frequency. The amygdala is receiving and responding to more of the available sensory data. The body is logging information that the conscious mind is still approaching. This is both the source of the gift and, under certain conditions, the source of the suffering. The body that notices first can alert you to something real, can register the subtle shift in a colleague's behavior that precedes the problem, can sense the emotional temperature of a room before the first sharp word, can know through accumulated somatic wisdom that this situation deserves attention. The same body, if it has been chronically activated, can also begin to log threats where none exist, to remain in alert posture long past the situation that originally warranted it. Bessel van der Kolk's clinical work with trauma patients documented this extensively. The nervous system that has been run at high alert for a long period does not simply relax when the threat is gone. It continues to generate threat signals from its own internal patterns. The body is still in the room from years ago. This is not weakness. It is the nervous system being thorough. But it means that the sensitive person who has been carrying too much for too long may need to address the body before they can effectively address the mind. Not through willpower, not through understanding, through physical safety, through the felt sense that this body in this room is held rather than threatened. Feel the weight of your body where it rests, the floor beneath you, the surface behind you, the warmth of the cover. The body notices first, but what it can also notice, when the conditions allow, is safety. That is what sleep is, at its best. A period in which the body updates its assessment, in which the nervous system, finally unchallenged, can begin to release the posture it has been holding. That releasing begins now, slow, without effort. The body knows how. We continue. Chapter 28, Trauma and Emotional Radar. Jung was careful not to use the word trauma freely. The term derives from the Greek for wound, and in clinical psychology it was used precisely to describe the lasting impact of experiences that overwhelmed the nervous system's capacity to integrate them. He was careful about it because he was a careful thinker, but he was deeply aware of what it described. Many of his patients had experienced what the contemporary field would now call adverse childhood experiences. Not always the dramatic, nameable events of catastrophe, but the more diffuse and chronic experiences of emotional neglect, inconsistency, parental dysregulation, or the sustained atmosphere of a household in which something was very wrong and no one said so. These experiences, he observed, did something specific to perception. They calibrated the nervous system toward threat. The child who grew up in a household where the atmosphere could turn without warning learns to read the atmosphere with extraordinary precision. They learn to detect the early signals, the slight change in a parent's breathing, the particular quality of a silence before an eruption, and to organize their behavior accordingly. This is survival intelligence, but it is also a form of calibration that does not reset automatically when the original environment changes. The adult who grew up in that household enters every new room with the same scanning equipment. They read for threat. They are extraordinarily good at detecting subtle signals of hostility, instability, or concealed distress. They carry what Elaine Aron, in her 2010 revision of her work, called a sensitized emotional radar, a detection system that has been tuned by early experience to a very fine frequency. The radar is accurate, often remarkably so. The problem is that it cannot easily distinguish between the room from then and the room from now. It reads the present for evidence of the past. And because sensitive people are perceptive, they often find evidence that confirms their reading, not because they are wrong, but because humans are complex, and there is usually something, if you look carefully enough, that corresponds to what you are looking for. John Bowlby's attachment research, conducted across the 1950s through the 1970s, documented the formation of what he called internal working models, templates of self and other that form early in development and shape how we perceive and respond to relationships throughout our lives. The internal working model, formed in an unpredictable environment, predicts unpredictability. It reads ambiguity as threat. It is alert to abandonment before abandonment has any evidence. This is not a character defect. It is the mind doing exactly what it was shaped to do. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. The work of adulthood, and it is genuinely work, the kind that benefits from support, is to update the internal working model, not to erase the radar, but to recalibrate it for the environment you are actually in, rather than the one you survived. This happens slowly, through experience, specifically through repeated experiences of relationships that do not behave the way the model predicts. Through the gradual accumulation of evidence that the room you are in now is not the room from then. That accumulation takes time. Tonight, in this room, the walls are exactly where they are. The floor is holding. You are here, and you are safe. The radar can rest. We continue. Chapter 29, The Gift of Quiet Observation. There is a quality that the most perceptive people share that is almost never named as a skill. It is the capacity for quiet observation. Not the observation of the scientist who approaches an object with a methodology. Not the observation of the analyst who is already building an argument from the evidence. But simple, non-directed attention. The kind in which you are present to what is happening without having already decided what it means. Children are naturally capable of this. The child who sits for 20 minutes watching a beetle cross a stone, not trying to learn anything about beetles, simply following the movement, the color, the way the legs work. Most adults have had this capacity educated out of them. The school system, the professional world, the culture of productivity, all of them reward directed observation, the kind that produces results, not the kind that simply dwells. The sensitive person often retains something of this capacity, not always consciously, often as the thing they do when they think they are doing nothing, sitting at a window, in a garden, on a train, and registering the world without an agenda. This is not wasted time. Jung's own practice of quiet observation, his years of sitting on the shore at Bollingen, building with stones, listening to the lake, was not, he insisted, therapeutic in the conventional sense. He was not there to recover. He was there to receive, to let the unconscious offer what it had been holding without directing it toward any particular purpose. He called this active imagination, though the first phase of it is less active than the name suggests. The first phase is simply be present, without an agenda. Let the images come. Thoreau, who spent 2 years in a small wooden house at Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, between 1845 and 1847, described something similar. He was not there to conduct an experiment in poverty or self-sufficiency, as the popular version often suggests. He was there to pay attention. He wanted, he wrote in Walden, to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, not to extract the most from experience, but to be fully present to whatever was actually there. The capacity for quiet observation is the gift that the sensitive person was given before the world had a chance to tell them what they were supposed to be doing instead. Let your shoulders drop. You carry it still. In the ordinary moments, the pauses between meetings, the minutes before sleep, the wordless early mornings, it is available, not as a technique, just as permission. To not be doing anything in particular, to not be processing anything toward a conclusion, to simply be present to what is here, the room, the dark, the weight of the body, the breath moving of its own accord. This is enough. This is, in some moments, everything. We continue. Chapter 30. When sensitivity becomes wisdom. If your mind has wandered, come back gently. We are still here. Jung spent much of his clinical writing distinguishing between the first half of life and the second. In the first half, he argued, the primary task is differentiation, becoming a distinct self, separating from the parents, developing the persona, establishing a place in the world. The first half of life is concerned fundamentally with the question, who am I in relation to the world? In the second half, the question changes. It becomes, what is real? Not what is expected, not what is valued by the culture or the profession or the family. What is actually, genuinely, truly real in the life that remains? The sensitive person often reaches this question early, too early sometimes, for the cultural containers that are supposed to hold it. They are asking second-half questions in the first half. Not because they are advanced, because the depth of their perception means that the surface was never entirely satisfying. The persona never quite fit. The role was always slightly too small. The productivity was always slightly hollow in a way they could not explain to people for whom the productivity felt like an adequate account of themselves. And so they arrived at the second half's question, what is real? Not in their 60s, but in their 30s or 20s or even younger. The trouble is that the answer to this question is not available through analysis. You cannot think your way to what is real. You can only feel your way toward it slowly through a kind of sustained attention to experience that the sensitive person has been practicing all along without knowing it counted. This is where sensitivity becomes wisdom. Not through achievement, not through the accumulation of knowledge or the mastery of technique. Through the slow development of what Jung called psychological maturity, the capacity to hold complexity without demanding that it resolve, to remain in relationship with what is not yet understood, to trust the feeling function even when it cannot yet be articulated. Abraham Maslow, in his later work on what he called self-actualization, identified among the people he studied a quality he called tolerance for ambiguity, the ability to remain functional and even generative in the presence of unresolved questions. He found it consistently in people who had developed, through experience and reflection, a confident relationship with their own inner life. Not certainty, confidence, the sense that the interior is a reliable place to dwell. The sensitive person who has spent years learning to inhabit their own depth, to trust what they feel without being overwhelmed by it, to distinguish their perceptions from their projections, to rest in what cannot yet be resolved, that person has built something quiet, something that does not announce itself, but something that the people around them, in the most difficult moments of their lives, find themselves seeking out. Not because the wise person has answers, because they know how to be present to what is real. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. That is the arc of what we have been following tonight. From weight to wisdom, we keep going. Chapter 31, Boundaries for Tender Minds. The word boundary has become so ubiquitous in the contemporary vocabulary of self-help that it has nearly lost its usefulness. But the underlying concept, and Jung was working with it long before the terminology became fashionable, is essential for the sensitive person. A boundary, in the Jungian sense, is not a wall. It is not a withdrawal from contact. It is a differentiation, the maintenance of sufficient selfhood that contact can occur without dissolution. The sensitive person without adequate differentiation does not simply interact with other people, they merge with them. Their emotional state becomes continuous with the emotional states in the room. Their sense of who they are and what they feel is perpetually negotiated by the emotional weather around them. This is not, as Jung noted, particularly useful to anyone. The person who has no reliable self to bring to the relationship cannot truly be present to the other. They can only reflect, they can only absorb. They can only reshape themselves to match what seems to be required, which is, for all of its apparent selflessness, a form of disappearance. The development of what Jung called the differentiated self, the self that can enter the room, feel the room fully, and still know the difference between itself and the room, is the primary protective work for the sensitive person. Not building walls, not becoming less attuned, knowing where you end and the room begins. This requires regular practice in returning to oneself. What do I actually feel in this moment, as distinct from what is in the room? What do I actually want, as distinct from what seems to be wanted of me? What is my own body doing right now beneath the social performance and the attunement and the management of others' experience? Ethan Kross, in his research on the inner voice, found that creating what he called psychological distance, not emotional distance, but the slight narrative detachment that comes from observing oneself rather than simply being oneself, reduced the compulsive quality of emotional reactivity significantly. This is the beginning of differentiation. The small move from "I am overwhelmed" to "there is something overwhelming happening here and I am the one experiencing it." You, the one experiencing it, still exist. The room's emotional content is not you. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. Differentiation in practice looks less dramatic than the word suggests. It looks like pausing before responding, like noticing at the end of a conversation that you arrived with a feeling and now you have a different feeling, and asking which of these actually belongs to you. The boundary is not the refusal to feel. It is the refusal to forget who is doing the feeling. That distinction, when it becomes reliable, changes the quality of everything. We continue. Chapter 32, The Shadow of Compassion. There is a version of compassion that is not entirely what it appears to be. Jung was careful about this, particularly in his later clinical work. He had observed in himself and in many of his patients a pattern that he called the helping impulse, masking the control impulse. A genuine desire to relieve others' suffering, genuine, yes, not fabricated, that also served a function the helper was not entirely willing to acknowledge. If I am focused on your pain, I do not have to sit with my own. If I am the one who helps, I am not the one who is helped. If my value in the room is my availability and attunement to others, then my own needs can remain invisible. And invisible needs are safe. Invisible needs cannot be refused. This is the shadow of compassion. Not a reason to stop being compassionate, a reason to look at what the compassion is doing, in addition to what it appears to be doing. Irvin Yalom, in his 2002 memoir, The Gift of Therapy, described a pattern he encountered repeatedly among people drawn to the helping professions. Not because they were damaged, though some were, and were honest about it, but because the role of the helper solved certain questions about their own acceptability. If they were useful, they were welcome. If they were indispensable, they were safe. The shadow of compassion is the need beneath the giving. For the sensitive person, this shadow is almost universal. The capacity to attune to others' needs is so developed and so rewarded that it often becomes the primary channel through which the sensitive person seeks value. They give because they can, and also because giving is the one mode in which they have learned to be unambiguously welcome. To not be giving is to be simply themselves without the gift, and they have not always been sure that is enough. Let your jaw soften. This is not a criticism. It is the shadow asking to be seen. The sensitive person who can see this, who can acknowledge that some portion of their care for others is also care for themselves, that the compassion serves more than one purpose, does not thereby become less compassionate. They become more genuinely so, because they are no longer using their compassion to avoid themselves. They can be present to the other person's suffering without needing to resolve it, without needing to be needed, without the subtle transaction that was occurring beneath the surface of the generosity. True compassion does not deplete. What depletes is compassion that is also carrying the weight of your own unaddressed needs. The shadow, when integrated, is not eliminated. It is accompanied. You continue to help. You are simply also aware of why. We continue. Chapter 33. Why you absorb atmospheres. Jung spent considerable time in his lectures at the ETH Zurich in the late 1930s, discussing what he called the atmosphere of a place. He was not using the word loosely. He meant something specific. The accumulated emotional residue of what has happened in a location. The way that a building, a room, or a landscape carries something from its history. He was not speaking supernaturally. He was speaking phenomenologically. The house where something terrible happened often feels different, even to people who do not know the history. The room where joy was habitual has a quality. The office where anxiety is chronic, where the pressure is constant and the stakes are always high, develops an atmosphere that is detectable in the quality of air and sound and silence. Most people register this vaguely, if at all. The sensitive person registers it fully. This is the source of what is sometimes called the feeling of a place, the phenomenon whereby you know within minutes of entering whether this is somewhere you can rest or somewhere you must be vigilant. It is not magic. It is perception, operating at the level of subtle signals that the conscious mind has not yet organized into language. Researchers studying what they call ambient social cues have documented that people respond to environmental signals of mood, lighting quality, sound levels, the pace of movement around them, in ways that affect their own emotional state without their awareness. The sensitive person is not imagining the atmosphere. They are reading it. What they are sometimes less skilled at is releasing it when they leave. The atmosphere comes with them. It travels in the nervous system's assessment of the situation, in the body's ongoing reference to the felt quality of the last environment, in the mind's continuing processing of data that was taken in but not yet integrated. An evening, 1957. A woman visits a friend who is in the middle of a quietly difficult period. Nothing is said about it. The visit is pleasant. Tea is made. The afternoon passes. The woman goes home. She cannot sleep. She carries the atmosphere of what went unsaid. She does not know how to put it down because she cannot name what she is carrying. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. There is a practice that is simple enough to describe and requires only willingness to attempt. When you notice you are carrying an atmosphere that does not belong to you, name it as such. Not mine. Not a judgment of the environment, just a recognition that this particular quality of feeling arrived from elsewhere. It does not require your continued management. The body that registered it did its job. You can now gently let it move through rather than settle in. The atmosphere is not yours to carry home. We continue. Chapter 34. The unconscious hears everything. There is a quality of the unconscious that Jung described in many of his lectures, and that is both obvious and easy to forget. It is recording everything. While the conscious mind is occupied with the meeting agenda, the to-do list, the logistics of the day, while attention is rationed and directed and deployed toward what is currently considered important, the unconscious is receiving the full broadcast. Every tone of voice, every body posture, every implication in every sentence, every unspoken dynamic in every room. Nothing is filtered out. This is why sleep is not simply a period of physical rest. It is the period in which the unconscious gets to process what the conscious mind was too busy to handle. The material from the day, all of it, not just the parts you directed attention toward, gets sorted during sleep. Some of it moves into long-term memory. Some of it surfaces in dreams. Some of it is simply processed and released, the way the body processes food, metabolized and moved on. The sensitive person goes to sleep with a particularly full queue. They registered more during the day, their unconscious received more, the sorting takes longer. This is one of the reasons sleep is harder for the sensitive person, and one of the reasons it is so important. The day that moves through the sensitive person's nervous system is denser, more emotionally complex, more data-rich. The unconscious needs the sleep not as an indulgence, but as an operational necessity. Jung observed this clinically. Patients with rich, complex inner lives, the ones he found most interesting and often most difficult, were typically the worst sleepers. Not because they were broken, because they had more to process. He recommended, with characteristic directness, that they create conditions in which the unconscious could do its work. Regular sleep, consistent transition rituals, the deliberate cultivation of quiet before bed. Not exciting reading, not screens. Not another layer of input, something repetitive, gentle, unstimulating, that allowed the conscious mind to step back without drama and let the deeper processing begin. He also recommended what he called the evening imagination, a brief, undirected sitting at the end of the day, not to analyze, but to allow, to let whatever was unresolved surface gently and simply be present. Not a therapy session, a permission. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. The unconscious is working right now. You do not need to help it. You do not need to direct it. You do not need to decide what is important and what is not. It already knows. Let it work. The sorting is happening. The processing is underway. The day that moved through you is finding its resolution without your assistance. Your job now is simply to get out of the way. We continue. Chapter 35. Intuition and the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is among the most contested concepts Jung introduced. It is also, when approached carefully, among the most useful. He proposed it not as mysticism but as an empirical observation. In his clinical work, again and again, he encountered patients who produced in dreams and fantasies images that they had no apparent access to through their personal history. Medieval alchemical symbolism arising in the dreams of a woman with no historical training. Mythological motifs appearing in a child's spontaneous drawings that corresponded to ancient Egyptian or Greek patterns. His explanation was not supernatural. He proposed that beneath the personal unconscious, the layer of the psyche containing individual repressed memories and complexes, there exists a deeper layer, shared by all human beings. A layer formed over millennia of shared evolutionary and cultural experience. A layer in which certain patterns, certain figures, certain emotional structures are, in some sense, already present at birth. He called the contents of this layer archetypes, not fixed images, structural predispositions, the way that all water is predisposed to freeze at 0 degrees. The structure is built in, but the form it takes is shaped by the particular conditions. The great mother, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, the shadow. These are not stories someone invented. They are patterns that humans have been living and telling and dreaming for as long as we have been human. The sensitive person with their permeable membrane between consciousness and the unconscious often has closer access to this archetypal layer. Their intuitions sometimes arrive with a quality that exceeds what personal experience can account for. A sense of recognition that is deeper than memory. A feeling about a situation that corresponds not to anything in their individual history, but to something older. This is what is sometimes described, inadequately, as just knowing. The knowledge without a traceable source. Intuition, in Jung's typology, is precisely this: the perception of possibilities and implications that are not accessible to sensation or thought, the forward-scanning capacity of the psyche, the sense of where something is going before it has arrived. For the sensitive person whose intuitive function is strong, this can be both useful and disorienting. Useful because the intuition is often accurate. The sense that something is developing, that a pattern is emerging, that a situation is moving in a direction that is not yet visible. These readings tend to be correct more often than chance. Disorienting because the knowledge has no explainable basis. You cannot put it in a report. You cannot defend it in a meeting. You simply know. Let your shoulders drop. Trust that. Not blindly, not without the check of evidence, when evidence is available, but trust it as data, as one genuine mode of knowing that your particular psyche is equipped to perform. The collective unconscious hears beneath your individual experience, the accumulated wisdom of every human being who has ever sat in a dark room and tried to understand what was happening inside them. You are not the first to feel this. That is a form of companionship. We continue. Chapter 36. Self-worth in a numb world. Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections about what he called the problem of the modern man, not as a diagnosis of the present, but as an observation about a type that became more prevalent as Western culture moved further from its connection to the symbolic life. He described a person who was highly competent, highly functional, and quietly empty, who had achieved everything the culture asked of them and still experienced, in the private hours, a sense of meaninglessness that no additional achievement could resolve. He called this the neurosis of our time. But beneath the emptiness, in many of these patients, he found something else, a suppressed depth, a silenced sensitivity, a capacity for feeling and meaning that had been, over years and decades, systematically starved in favor of the productive and the rational. The world was not particularly interested in what they felt. The world was interested in what they could deliver. And so they delivered, and they suppressed, and they arrived in the office in Kusnacht at 55 wondering why the view from the summit felt so much like the valley. The sensitive person navigates a version of this constantly. The culture they inhabit is not calibrated for their mode of being. It values speed over depth. It rewards output over perception. It promotes people who move efficiently rather than people who move carefully. It treats the capacity to feel as a liability, except in specifically designated contexts, the therapy session, the eulogy, the art opening, where feeling is permitted because it has been contained. Everywhere else, perform, produce, deliver. And the sensitive person, because they are also frequently intelligent and capable, often does perform and produce and deliver. They do it very well. But at a cost that does not appear on any balance sheet. Self-worth for the sensitive person often has an unstable foundation, not because they lack capacity, frequently the reverse, but because the capacities they have developed most fully are the ones the culture values least openly. Reading rooms, attuning to people, perceiving implications, sitting with complexity, moving with care. These are not nothing. They are, in many of the most important moments of human life, everything. The parent at the hospital beside a child who cannot speak. The friend who stays when staying is all that is available. The colleague who notices, without being asked, that someone in the meeting was not okay. The person who knows when silence is more useful than speech. Maslow, in his later work on the peak experience, described moments of profound self-recognition, moments in which a person feels, briefly and completely, that they are exactly who they are supposed to be. He found these moments not primarily in achievement, but in deep, present, fully felt contact with experience. The sensitive person has these moments more than they realize. They tend to dismiss them because they arrive without external validation, because the culture around them did not seem to notice. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. Your worth is not the thing the world has been measuring. It is the thing you carry into every room you enter, whether or not anyone there has the capacity to receive it. We continue. Chapter 37. The soul that feels too early. There is a particular quality that some children have that the adults around them sometimes call old. Not old in experience, old in some way that is harder to name. A seriousness, a quality of attention, a capacity to sit with things that other children of their age seem not to feel the need to sit with. These children have been feeling, since very early, what most people will not feel until much later in their lives. They have been asking the second-half questions in primary school, sitting with the weight of what is unresolved at an age when the culture assumes resolution is not yet necessary. Jung described his own childhood this way. He was a solitary boy in the parsonage at Klein Huningen, near Basel. While other children played, he sat on a particular stone wall and thought. He called the stone his stone, not with sentimentality, but with precision. There was something about sitting on it that felt like contact with what he called his number 2 personality, the deeper, older self that felt ancient in a way he could not explain. He did not think he was special. He thought he was strange. The soul that feels too early is often convinced it is strange. It has not yet found the context in which its quality is recognized as a form of intelligence rather than a deviation from the norm. Kierkegaard was this child, the melancholy young man in Copenhagen who read and thought and sat with things in a way that the people around him found difficult to understand, who seemed always to be in contact with something that others had not yet encountered. He wrote in his journals at 19, "What I really lack is to be clear in my mind what I am to do, not what I am to know." He was not confused. He was ahead of the question. The soul that feels too early often arrives at wisdom, genuine wisdom, the kind earned through sustained contact with difficult experience, before they have the social structures to contain it, before they have the language to share it, before they have found the other people who share the frequency, and so they carry it alone for years, sometimes decades. Let your jaw soften. The weight you have been carrying, some of it dates back very far, earlier than adulthood, earlier than the professional world. It goes back to the particular child you were in the particular household where you learned that the world did not always have space for what you were already feeling. That child was not wrong. That child was simply early. Early to the questions that everyone eventually faces. Early to the depth that, for most people, only life's losses eventually excavate. You have been living at a depth for a long time that others are just beginning to reach. That is a form of experience that deserves acknowledgement. Not celebration, acknowledgement. We continue. Chapter 38. Why Truth Feels Emotional. There is a persistent cultural assumption that emotion and truth are in tension. That the more emotional you are about something, the less clearly you are thinking about it. That the clear-eyed, rational assessment is the one that has been purged of feeling. Jung spent his career arguing against this assumption, not in the abstract, in the consulting room, with evidence. The feeling function, he argued, is a cognitive function. It processes information, it produces assessments that are as sophisticated and often more contextually accurate than the judgments produced by rational analysis. The difference is not between accuracy and inaccuracy, it is between two different kinds of data. Rational analysis works with what is explicit, quantifiable, and consistent. It is excellent for certain kinds of decisions. Feeling works with what is implicit, relational, and contextually embedded. It is excellent for different kinds of decisions. For decisions in which what matters is not the most logically defensible option, but the most humanly true one. And the most humanly true thing is often not the most logically defensible one. The woman who knows her marriage is over before anything dramatic has happened is not being irrational. She is processing a vast amount of relational data, tone shifts, silences, the quality of attention, the texture of ordinary exchanges, and arriving at a conclusion that her feeling function reached long before her rational function was ready to confirm it. She is right, and she is often told that she is being emotional. The philosophers who have taken this seriously tend to reach similar conclusions through very different routes. Blaise Pascal, the French mathematician and philosopher who died in Paris in 1662, wrote in his Pensées, "The heart has its reasons, of which reason knows nothing." He was not being romantic. He was being precise. He was describing a mode of knowing that operates by its own logic, through its own faculties, and arrives at its own truths. He was describing the feeling function 3 centuries before Jung named it. Martha Nussbaum, the American philosopher who published Upheavals of Thought in 2001, argued at length that the emotions are not merely reactions to a preformed judgment. They are themselves a form of judgment. They encode evaluations of what matters, what is threatened, what is worth grieving or celebrating. They are, she argued, intelligent responses to the world. This is what the sensitive person knows from the inside. When they feel something deeply about a situation, they are not losing their grip on clarity. They are gaining a different kind of clarity. One that is not always welcome in rooms organized around different kinds of knowing. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. The truth of what you feel is not the enemy of the truth of what you think. They are 2 instruments. You happen to have one of them tuned very finely. We continue. Chapter 39. Emotional Healing Through Discernment. Jung did not believe in healing in the sense of returning to a prior state. He was skeptical of the popular therapeutic promise of recovery, of being fixed, of getting back to how you were before. He thought this was, in most cases, both impossible and actually undesirable. You were not wounded, on the way to becoming yourself. The wound was often part of the becoming. What he believed in was something more modest and more demanding. The ongoing development of relationship with what is inside you, the slow accumulation of self-knowledge, the gradual development of the capacity to live with yourself with some degree of clarity and honesty. He called this individuation. And he was clear that it was the work of a lifetime, not the result of a breakthrough. For the sensitive person, one of the central tasks of this work is what he called the development of discernment. Discernment, in this context, is not criticism. It is the cultivated ability to distinguish what you are feeling from why you are feeling it, to distinguish what belongs to you from what you have absorbed from the room, to distinguish perception from projection, to distinguish the voice of a complex from the voice of genuine insight, to distinguish the kind of exhaustion that calls for rest from the kind that calls for change. These are not fine, you said. Continue. 7:36 p.m. Claude responded, distinctions in the abstract. Distinctions in the abstract. In practice, they are often the difference between a decision that comes from clarity and a decision that comes from a pattern that has been running without examination for decades. Frankl developed, in his years of clinical work after the camps, what he called logotherapy, a therapeutic approach centered not on the analysis of the past, but on the clarification of meaning in the present and future. He was less interested in why you feel what you feel than in what you intend to do with it. He believed, and the evidence he accumulated suggested, that the capacity to make meaning out of experience, to convert suffering into purpose, was among the most powerful forms of healing available. Not because the suffering is erased, because it becomes something. For the sensitive person who has spent years feeling without knowing what the feeling was for, this is the turn. Not to stop feeling, but to develop a more skillful relationship with what is felt. To become more discerning, not colder, but clearer. The feeling that surfaces tonight, the weight in the chest, the mind still running, the accumulated data from a day spent at full sensitivity, does not require a decision. It requires only honest acknowledgement. Yes, I felt all of this today, and now, slowly, I can put it down. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The discernment that comes with time is not distance. It is the capacity to be fully present to your experience without being swept away by it. That is not less feeling. That is better feeling. We are near the end now. Chapter 40. Sensitivity without collapse. There is a distinction that Jung made late in his clinical career that is among the most practically useful things he left behind. He distinguished between what he called negative capability, the capacity to remain in uncertainty, mystery, and doubt without reaching for resolution, and what he called undifferentiated absorption, the state in which the sensitive person has lost the thread of their own experience and is simply living inside whatever the room contains. The first is a strength. The second is a wound. The sensitive person who has negative capability can walk into a difficult room and feel everything in it without being defined by what they feel. Can sit with someone's grief without becoming the grief. Can absorb the emotional weather of a gathering without carrying it home as their own. They are fully in contact. And they are still themselves. The sensitive person who has not yet developed this, who has instead been living in a state of ongoing absorption, is genuinely suffering. Not because they feel too much, but because they have no reliable place to return to when the feeling becomes overwhelming. They have not yet developed what Jung would call the center of the self, the reliable internal point of orientation, the part of the psyche that remains when everything else is in motion. He worked toward this in his patients and in himself, through a practice he never fully systematized, but always returned to: the development of a relationship with the self as distinct from the persona, the shadow, the complexes, and the emotional field of the relational world. Not the self of popular usage, not self-esteem, not self-improvement, not the curated identity. The self in the Jungian sense, the organizing center of the whole psyche, the thing that was there before the adaptations, the thing that remains when the performances stop. The practice of returning to it is ultimately what tonight has been, not through technique, through a slow, gentle, sustained attention to what is genuinely and irreducibly yours: your breath, your body, your particular way of noticing, your history of perception that no one else has. That is not nothing. That is everything. Let your shoulders drop. Sensitivity without collapse is not the elimination of feeling. It is the development of the internal ground from which feeling can be fully had. You can feel everything, and you can remain yourself while you do. That is the work. It is slow work. It is sometimes uncomfortable work. But the fact that you are here at the end of a long night, still present to the ideas we have been moving through, that says something. You are not collapsing. You are integrating, one breath at a time. We continue. Chapter 41. Individuation of the feeling type. Jung's concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming more fully oneself, operates differently for different psychological types. For the feeling type, the process has particular contours. The feeling type's dominant function is their greatest gift, and, without the development of the inferior function, their greatest limitation. The feeling type who has not developed their thinking function cannot evaluate their emotional responses critically. They cannot step back from what they feel long enough to ask whether it is tracking something real or running an old script. They drown in the feeling. Conversely, the feeling type who has been pressured by family or culture or profession to suppress the feeling function in favor of rational analysis, who has spent 30 years learning to be analytical and efficient and clear-eyed at the expense of what they were actually built for, has something different to recover. Not to become more emotional. They already feel more than they can hold. but to reclaim the feeling as legitimate cognitive function, to stop apologizing for it, to begin integrating it into their decision-making, their relationships, their self-understanding as data rather than noise. Jung's individuation process, in his own case, involved a careful and sustained engagement with his interior life that he began in his late 30s and never entirely concluded. He spent the second half of his life not becoming more competent in the world's terms, though he continued to write and practice and publish, but becoming more fully himself, more capable of holding his own depth, more able to be present to his own experience without flinching. The tower at Bollingen was part of this. He built it with his hands. He cooked on an open fire. He drew water from a well. He did these things not as an eccentric affectation, but as a deliberate practice of presence, of contact with the immediate, the material, the real. For the feeling type, individuation often requires something similar, not necessarily manual labor or rural simplicity, though for some people exactly that, but some reliable practice of returning to direct, unmediated experience, not the curated experience, not the experience prepared for an audience, the experience that is simply there when the performance stops. A garden, an instrument, a walk with no destination, a morning without a schedule. The body doing something with its hands for reasons that have nothing to do with productivity. The self that is there in those moments is the self that individuation is trying to recover. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. For the feeling type, the path inward is not through analysis. It is through presence, not to ideas about experience. To experience itself. You are having it now. We continue. Chapter 42. Peace beyond overstimulation. The modern world is extraordinarily loud, not just acoustically, informationally, relationally. The volume of input that arrives every day through the ordinary channels of a connected adult life, the screens, the notifications, the news, the ambient social obligation, the professional communication, the background hum of other people's crises and celebrations and opinions would have been unimaginable to any prior generation. For the sensitive person, this volume is not a minor inconvenience. It is a sustained assault on a system that was never designed to receive it. Thoreau, writing in 1854 about his experiment at Walden Pond, was concerned with what he called the deliberate life. Not the full life in the sense of the busy life, but the full life in the sense of the consciously chosen life, in which you know why you are doing what you are doing, in which the input is proportionate to the processing capacity. He was not against civilization, he was against the unconscious surrender to its pace. The sensitive person who has not been able to slow down, who has been running at the speed the world demands, processing everything the world generates, absorbing every atmosphere and picking up every signal, is not tired in the way that rest resolves. They are overstimulated in the way that only genuine quiet resolves. Genuine quiet is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of demand. The cessation of the expectation that you will receive, process, respond, adapt, and deliver. Most people get this in sleep. The sensitive person often gets it incompletely even in sleep, because the queue of unprocessed material is still running when they lie down. Jung described what he called the restoration of psychic energy, the process by which the exhausted psyche, given adequate quiet, begins to generate its own light again. Not through effort, through the cessation of effort. This is not laziness. It is the specific physiological and psychological requirement of a system that has been asked to do a great deal. Let your jaw soften. The pace at which you have been living, the attentiveness, the attunement, the sustained processing of more than others realize you are processing, deserves a corresponding quality of rest. Not merely the absence of activity, true quiet. The kind in which the scanning slows. The kind in which the nervous system receives the message that the processing is complete and the next task does not begin until morning. That message is arriving now. You have done enough today. You have perceived enough, felt enough, held enough. The rest of the night belongs to a different order of processing, the unconscious kind, the kind that does not require your presence. You can leave the work to it. It is reliable. It knows what to do. We continue. Chapter 43. The wisdom of soft strength. There is a kind of strength that the culture tends to overlook because it does not announce itself. It does not raise its voice. It does not dominate a room. It does not produce the kinds of outputs that generate public recognition or professional advancement in the usual modes. But it is strength. The strength of the person who has felt everything and is still here, who has absorbed the grief and the tension and the unwitnessed perceptions of decades and has not closed down, who is still present, still willing to feel, still capable of being moved. This is not resilience in the contemporary sense. Resilience has become a word that is sometimes used to ask more of people who are already giving more than they should have to. Go back faster. Recover more quickly. Be functional again. That is not the kind of strength I am describing. I am describing the strength of sustained tenderness, of the person who has been hurt and who has not, in response, become hard, who has every reason to protect themselves with distance and armor, and who chooses, still, to remain open, not naively, not without discernment, but genuinely open. Lao Tzu, writing in what is believed to be the 6th century BCE in the Tao Te Ching, described the quality of water. It is the softest thing in nature, he wrote, and yet it carves through stone. Not through force, through patient, sustained, gentle presence. This is the soft strength, the kind that does not try to overcome but simply persists. The sensitive person carries this strength, often without knowing it, often while convinced that what they carry is a liability. The person in this room tonight, the one who feels too much, who absorbs atmospheres, who lies awake processing what others release without effort, is not weak. They are carrying a form of strength that the culture's current instruments are not especially well calibrated to measure. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. That weight is not burden. It is the specific gravity of someone who takes life seriously, who does not move through the world lightly, not because they are burdened, but because they are paying attention. That is soft strength. And the world, in its most honest moments, in its most difficult hours, reaches for it. You have been reached for. You have been the person others call in the 3 a.m. moment, not by accident, because they knew what you carry and they trusted it. That trust is not nothing. It is the world's recognition of the strength you were told was a weakness. We are near the end. Chapter 44. Letting the world pass through. There is a particular quality of mind that certain meditative traditions describe and that Jung approached from a different angle. It is the state in which experience is allowed to pass through rather than be held. Not suppression, not dissociation, not the absence of feeling, the opposite, full feeling, without the grasping that normally accompanies it. The feeling arrives, it is fully felt, and then it moves on. The grief is real. The anxiety is real. The tenderness in the room is real. But they are not gripped. They move through the way weather moves through a landscape. The landscape is fully affected. The trees bend, the grass flattens. The surface of the lake changes, but when the weather passes, the landscape remains. This is what the Taoist concept of Wu Wei describes, in part, effortless action. The natural responsiveness of a system that is not resisting what arrives, not controlling its output through effort, simply being present to what is and responding naturally to what it asks. For the sensitive person, the difficulty is usually not the feeling, it is the holding. The difficulty of letting the feeling complete its movement through the nervous system and then release. Instead, the feeling arrives and gets held, examined, analyzed, run past again to see if it looks different from a different angle, run past again and again. The analysis is not unkind. It comes from a genuine desire to understand. But understanding is not always what the feeling needs. Sometimes it needs only to move. Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Zen monk who died in 2022 after a lifetime of teaching and of personal practice that spanned some of the worst violence of the 20th century, described a practice he called recognizing the feeling, not analyzing it, not transforming it, simply acknowledging it. Hello, grief, I see you, and then watching it move. He was not suggesting distance, he was suggesting the kind of presence in which nothing needs to be held longer than it naturally wants to stay. The room is still. If your mind has been drifting, let it drift. The body knows where we are. The feelings of today, the accumulated data, the atmospheric residue, the unwitnessed perceptions, the emotional weight of sustained attunement, they do not require your continued management. They can move. Let them move. Not by trying, by ceasing to hold. That is the practice. Small, humble, available right now. The world passes through. You remain. We continue. Chapter 45, The Quiet Work of Integration. Jung's late writing is different from his early work. The early work is brilliant and systematic. The word association experiments, the typology, the theory of the complex, the conceptual scaffolding of the unconscious. It is the work of a mind at the height of its analytical power, building a framework that could hold the full complexity of the psyche. The late work is quieter. In memories, dreams, reflections, composed in conversation with Aniela Jaffe in the final decade of his life and published the year of his death in 1961, Jung does not argue. He reflects. He writes about the tower at Bollingen as the place where he became what he was, where the persona fell away, not dramatically, but slowly, like sediment settling from water that has been disturbed and is finally becoming still. He writes about the trees on the lake shore, about his practice of painting in the morning and returning to the painting in the afternoon and discovering each time that something had happened in the interval that he had not decided. He writes about the dead not with grief, but with a kind of open companionship, as if the dead had not left, but simply moved to a different room in the house of experience. This is what integration looks like at the end of a long life of conscious effort. Not the resolution of contradiction, not the elimination of the shadow or the silencing of the complexes, but the slow development of a relationship with all of it. The depth, the darkness, the difficulty, in which nothing has to be hidden and nothing has to be performed. The person who has been through this process, partially, imperfectly, over years, has a particular quality. They are difficult to rattle, not because they don't feel, because they have been feeling for so long. That feeling has become familiar even when it is uncomfortable. They know that the feeling will move. They have evidence. And they have learned to be present to others who are in the early part of the process, the part where the feeling is new and seems permanent, with a kind of patient confidence. It moves. Everything moves. Feel the weight of your body where it rests. The quiet work of integration is not a project. It is not something you complete. It is how you live when you have decided to pay attention. And you have been paying attention for a long time. The attention itself is the work. Nothing else is required. We are nearly there. Chapter 46, Resting the Attuned Mind. There is a moment, somewhere in the long process of falling asleep, when the mind that has been scanning and sorting and processing finally releases its grip. Not through effort. It cannot be forced. It arrives when the conditions allow. For the sensitive person, the conditions require something specific, a genuine sense that there is nothing left that requires attention. That the processing can stop, not because it is complete, but because it is enough. This is different from the exhaustion that drives most people into sleep. The exhaustion that simply says, I can no longer continue. What we are working toward tonight is the other kind, the settling that says, I have done what can be done today. The rest belongs to something else. Jung described this in the context of his nightly practice. Before sleep, he would sometimes write in his notebooks, not a diary, not a record of the day, but a brief notation of whatever was most unresolved, not to solve it. To give it a container outside of his own mind, so that the mind could release the holding function. A small act, but precise. It says, I see you. I am not abandoning you. I am simply passing you to the keeping of the night. And then sleep. The attuned mind, given this permission, is actually very good at resting. Because it has been working so hard for so long, the relief is profound when the conditions for rest finally arrive. Those conditions are here. The room is still. The world outside has quieted. The body has been given permission. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let your breath find its own rhythm, not slower or deeper than it wants to go, just its own. The scanning is complete. The processing is complete enough. Everything that needed to be felt today was felt. Everything that needed to be noticed was noticed. The work of the day is done. What remains? The things that are still unresolved, the things that have no answer yet, the feelings that have not yet found their names. They will wait. They are patient. They know you will return. For now, there is only the weight of the body and the quiet and the dark and the breath moving of its own accord, the way it has been moving since before you had any say in the matter. That is enough. That has always been enough. We continue gently to the end. Chapter 47. A Gentle Return Inward. In 1907, Carl Jung sat across from a patient in the Bergolsli Clinic in Zurich. She was a woman who had been institutionalized for years, diagnosed as psychotic, difficult to reach. Most of the clinical staff had largely given up on meaningful contact. Jung spent time with her, not in formal sessions exactly, sitting with her, asking her what she thought about, listening not to evaluate the content for signs of pathology, but to understand the person behind it. Over time, she began to trust. She began to speak. What she spoke about was not madness. It was a world of extraordinary symbolic richness, images, figures, recurring patterns that Jung recognized as archaic, as old, as belonging to something deeper than her personal history. He did not cure her. He did not return her to normal functioning. But he gave her something that most of us need and rarely receive: the experience of being fully encountered, of having what she carried taken seriously, not as symptom, but as content, as a form of life. He returned her gently to herself. This is what a gentle return inward means. Not a retreat from the world, not a closing of doors. A movement back toward the truth of your own experience, after a long day of moving outward into the world's requirements. The outward movement is necessary. You live in the world. You have obligations, relationships, responsibilities that require you to be present in ways that are not always aligned with your deepest nature. But the movement back is equally necessary. Without it, the outward movement becomes the whole of life. And the person who has been outward for too long, who has been performing, managing, adapting, attuning, absorbing, begins to lose the thread of what is actually theirs, what they actually feel, what they actually believe, who they actually are when the requirements stop. Right now, in this room, the requirements have stopped. There is nothing being asked of you. The performance has ended. The persona can be set down. Notice your breath. You do not need to change it. Let the attention move inward, not to solve anything, not to analyze, just to be in the company of the person who has been carrying all of today. They are tired, and they did well, and they deserve to be seen by the only witness that matters right now, themselves. The room is quiet. The night holds you. What is genuinely yours, what has always been yours, beneath all the adaptations, is here. Still here, always here. We go to the last chapter now. Chapter 48, Sleep for the Sensitive Soul. It began in a room like this one. Still, dark. The world outside gone quiet enough that the interior could finally be heard. We have spent these hours with Carl Jung and the thinkers who extended his work. Kierkegaard sitting alone with the weight of freedom, Frankl finding meaning in the worst conditions human beings have created, Bowlby describing the early calibration of a nervous system that was designed for attunement, Aaron documenting in careful empirical terms what many sensitive people had known about themselves for decades without language for it. We have moved through the shadow and the persona, through projection and the complexes, through the quiet loneliness of perceiving what others do not, through the gift that has so often felt in this culture like a liability, and we arrive here, in a body that has been carrying more than it was designed to carry alone, in a mind that has been processing more than the world had language for, in a room that is finally quiet enough. Jung wrote late in his life that he had spent decades trying to understand the psyche from the outside, through theory, through clinical work, through the accumulated evidence of thousands of hours in the consulting room, and that the most important things he learned from attending to his own interior, from the years of sitting at Bollingen with the lake and the fire and the stones, from the willingness to encounter what was inside him without immediately trying to explain it. He concluded that the psyche's deepest orientation is toward wholeness, not toward happiness, not toward success, not toward the resolution of all contradiction, toward wholeness, the ongoing, imperfect, never completed project of bringing all of what you are into some kind of conscious relationship. The sensitive person who is still awake tonight, who has spent their life feeling what others do not feel, perceiving what others do not perceive, carrying what others do not know they are carrying, is not failing at wholeness. They are in it. They have always been in it. The depth was never the problem. The problem was only the absence of a container large enough to hold it without shame. Tonight is such a container, and now the container can be set down. The body is held. The room is still. The processing is done for tonight. Whatever remains unresolved will return tomorrow, and you will meet it with the resources of a rested body and a mind that has had the night to do what conscious effort cannot. The sensitive soul does not need to toughen. It needs to rest. The feeling does not need to stop. It needs to be allowed to move when it is ready, through and out. The perception does not need to be dimmed. It needs a room that is quiet enough for it to settle, like a lake after wind, until the surface goes still enough to reflect the sky. The surface is settling right now, in this room, in your body. In the breath moving of its own accord, the way it always has, the way it always will, without your assistance, without your permission, steady and old as the first rhythm of the world. You have felt everything today that was yours to feel, and some things that were not yours, and that can now be released. The room is yours. The night is yours. The quiet is yours. Let it hold you. There is nothing left to do. Sleep now.